Hey guys, you are watching your anime world. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see what if Deku fell from grace and became a vigilante. Here is short summary. Deku had fallen to the surface whilst everybody he knew ascended beyond their wildest dreams. Izuku Midoriya, now a teacher at UA High, can't bring himself to sit still as he watches others follow a dream that escaped his grasp. A new vigilante appears on the streets, causing inconveniences for heroes and police alike, and Pro-Hero Dynamite is tasked with the job of taking the guy down. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. Katsuki only had two philosophies. The first one, unsurprisingly, was to win. Victory was a priority in his eyes, a reward for living and putting up with the annoying who pissed him off all day. That's where the second philosophy came from: stay away from annoying people. In his eyes, the latter feeling was hard to follow. To achieve his first philosophy, Katsuki had to allow his second to follow through. This was basically impossible. To put it frankly, the pro's job description made it pretty hard to follow his beliefs, and therefore he was stuck with annoying people during most of his patrol hours. The annoying genre didn't just dictate towards villains or civilians either. Most of the people who pissed him off were lesser heroes who he'd hired within his own agency or heroes he was forced to complete missions with. Sure, Pro-Hero Dynamite wasn't the same bratty kid that he was during his UA years, but he sure as hell wasn't a brand new person. His temperance was still horrifically fragile. He was still Katsuki Bakugo. That's why Katsuki made a very good impression on those around him, indenturing into their mind his desire to work independently. UA had taught him that heroism was more sufficient when team-oriented, and he never really liked that too much. But, to be a successful pro like he'd dreamed of since he was a toddler, he knew that teamwork was a necessity. That's why he was one of the first from his graduating class to set up an agency. That's why Dynamite's work studies were some of the most desired opportunities for high schoolers. Katsuki would have liked to be number one, but despite his hard work and passion, he lacked that joy and charm those higher owned. Dynamite was way above them all when it came to awe and admiration. He made an impact on both villains and dream-filled kids who saw him in action, but it was the snark in interviews and the frown that encased his face which made people such as Mirio tower above him. He didn't care though. He'd lost that dream at 17, escaping along with the tears that fell at the green-haired nerd's bedside. Dynamite could never be number one, because Katsuki Bakugo had lost his competitor. To add to his social mess, despite interacting with those in his agency, Katsuki couldn't bring himself to face his former classmates. If they interacted during work, he'd talk casually and briefly to them before leaving at the first opportunity. In any other case, he'd try to avoid the gang at all costs. From what he'd heard, they all kept in touch often. Quiet, annoying pings would sound from his phone every time they messaged each other in the stupid group chat which Katsuki had tried to leave on multiple occasions. Each time, he was added back almost immediately. At first, the blonde didn't really mind the interactions. It was a harmless group chat that he could put on silent and ignore as much as he wanted. On occasion, he found himself curiously reading the messages between each other, shamelessly peeking into their lives. In Katsuki's eyes, an issue only arose 2 years after graduation. After a hard, annoying-ass day fighting extras who thought they could challenge him to a battle, he spent the evening relaxing. That was rare itself. The hero lived in an apartment in the city center, right in the middle of all the action. Despite his wealth, he was rather demure about it and wasn't one to show off his private life. The apartment wasn't cheap, and he could definitely afford better, but he didn't want better. It also made him feel relatively safer. Nobody expected Dynamite to live where he did, so no opponents came looking for him there. In essence, the action within the city is what kept him awake and working. But still, for once in his goddamn life, he decided to take a break that evening. Laying on his bed, one arm behind his head and another scrolling on his phone, he checked the basics: news, ratings, anything that had his face or name plastered atop it. And then he got that notification. Red Riot added you to heroes before BEROS. Katsuki scoffed, pressing the notification. He couldn't help but form a small smirk at the group name and winced as an influx of messages engulfed his screen. Katsuki rolled his eyes and swiped off the group, his intrigue passing and boredom quickly setting in. The group chats were often kept active by that same small amount of people. However, the blonde had previously noticed people like Jiro and Tokiyami popping in to add a few irrelevant words. In the original chat, Deku was the biggest contender to begin conversations. That was mostly the reason why Katsuki didn't talk in it. He didn't hate Deku. God, no. After all the shit they'd been through, Katsuki would have to be an evil and apathetic man to dislike the guy even a little bit. But there was a solid reason he couldn't find himself the influence to seek out the nerd's company. Whenever he thought of Deku, he didn't see that smiley, freckled-faced kid he knew all too well. Instead, he saw the war. He saw blood and death. He saw tears, pain and agony. He saw a helpless child on a hospital bed, quirkless, wearing the most despicable, fake grin that Katsuki had ever seen in his life. He saw guilt. Because that was it. Guilt. Every single time he saw Deku, his chest tightened in harrowing regret and guilt. He didn't have much to be guilty of, sure, as Deku was the one who got himself into the mess by accepting the quirk from All Might in the first place, but he still couldn't help it. Over the second and third years of UA, and then the 2 years spent alone as a pro, not a day went by where Katsuki didn't ponder over the past. He could proudly say that he and Deku parted on good terms, but watching the boy at the graduation ceremony, smiling at the others as they discussed their futures as pro-heroes, was excruciating. He and Icy Hot had noticed it, but other than them, the rest of the class was completely oblivious to Deku's inner turmoil. This kid had lost a lot, and whilst everybody else had clear, straight paths to the future, Deku's was hazy. Katsuki only hoped that the Icy Hot bastard was visiting the guy, but he knew that was very unlikely. It was only at times like these that he himself had a chance to visit others. Hell, he barely saw his parents as it was, let alone Deku. If Dynamite's schedule was that tight, Shoto's was no doubt worse. Because of that, Katsuki didn't go out of his way to see Deku. He wouldn't have disliked an interaction, but he never sought one. It was a kind of fear. No, it wasn't fear, it was more like distaste. He'd apologized to the nerd more times than he was proud of, but reflecting on his past, he felt kind of embarrassed to be around him. Even the thought kind of pissed him off. A worry that surfaced often was the chance of others facing this same challenge, feeling guilt when they saw or spoke to Deku. Deku had fallen to the surface whilst everybody he knew ascended beyond their wildest dreams. All they knew was hero work. They couldn't go up to Deku, who was working as a Ing teacher, and yap about their great adventures and struggles. When the news came from Deku saying that UA had personally asked him to work there, the messages seemed sincere and happy for him, but Katsuki, even through the screen, noticed that same burden of guilt that they all carried. It was very likely that Katsuki wasn't the only one who avoided Deku out of guilt. That was a jarring thought. And so, Bakugo found himself opening the group once again. His eyes scanned the top of the screen before he pressed on the cringe-ass name, probably titled by Kaminari, and scrolled down the members list. It was everybody he knew from Class A, along with a few others from Class B and some from Shiketsu. He also noticed some names of older heroes, like Lemillion and Sunniator. Either way, he knew all of these people, and his scrolling turned slightly more frantic as he searched for the name he knew all too well. Deku. He bit his tongue, halting his search and scanning for another name instead. Izuku Midoriya. Nothing. Deku wasn't in the group. Yeah, Deku wasn't a pro, but he was still a Ing hero. His name would be in literal history books for the sacrifices he made. The National Hero School of Japan literally asked him to be a high-ranking staff member. He wasn't glazing Deku, and he would be caught dead before he ever did, but if you asked young kids nowadays, even most adults, who the greatest hero of all time was, they wouldn't say All Might. They wouldn't say Endeavor. They'd all say Deku. His fears had been proven. From that point, Katsuki didn't talk in any of the group chats. The original died and went inactive, and he neglected the second one so much that he had thousands of messages piling up. He just wouldn't talk in a hero group chat without the world's greatest hero. Dynamite was too good for that. Dynamite had standards. His phone lit up with a loud ring that forced Katsuki back into reality. Call from that police guy. Sitting up, he furrowed his eyebrows. Tsukauchi. Unwillingly, he put the phone to his ear. Bit late, don't you think? He growled. A sigh sounded from the other line. Dynamite, you like to work alone, right? Katsuki tilted his head. If you're gonna make me work as surveillance or something, I will kick your head. I'll meet you at your agency tomorrow. Say, 9. He cut off the hero. Katsuki growled, but Tsukauchi ignored him. Something has been causing us trouble for a while. What is it? We'll go over that tomorrow, he insisted. But as far as villains go, I think you're the only guy who can kick some sense into this one. You can't just. The call ended. Quote exclamation mark quote. Great, thought Katsuki, getting up and heading to the shower. Another early wake up is just what I need. Chapter text. Mr. Deku. 2 pairs of shuffling feet came to a halt behind him as the sheepish male voice spoke up. Izuku. Despite his slight agitation due to his excessive hunger, his alarm didn't go off and he missed breakfast. Lunch was his first meal of the day, and he had yet to get to it. Turned around to face the students with a comforting smile. Can I help you? He hummed, crossing his arms and tilting his head slightly. He was wearing a navy sweater and black jeans. It became clear to Izuku within his first week of teaching at UA that the dress code for staff was very casual. Given the fact most of the teachers walked around in their hero costumes, he wasn't sure how he didn't pick that up in high school. From that point on, he reserved button-downs for special occasions and resorted to sweaters and plain t-shirts as his workwear. The 2 kids were from his homeroom class and were rather good at their studies. If he could pinpoint them to anybody he knew, he'd relate to Kaminari and Jiro. The tall girl had relative control over herself and her confidence. She was never afraid to ask questions or for support, and always had an earbud in her ear. Other teachers would tell her off for the latter act, but Deku understood. Focusing isn't always easy, and the girl had good grades. If the music helped her, then so be it. The boy was more of a talker than a doer. Deku often had to quiet him down or give him catch-up work because he was too distracted by something else to do what was set for him in class. After standing in an awkward, yet comforting, silence for a few moments, it was hard to be awkward around Mr. Deku. His presence was overwhelmingly welcoming. The girl spoke up. Yuji has a question, she said. He keeps trying to get me to ask you about it, but I told him he needs to grow a pair. Deku laughed. Go ahead. Is it class-related? Said the boy. Not really. Just spit it out. The girl hissed. Take your time, began Deku before being cut off by rambling. It's just I feel awkward asking this because you're Deku, and obviously you're cooler than all of them, but, he trailed off. Placing a comforting hand on his shoulder, Deku took a step forward and knelt down to try and soothe the boy's nerves. Izuku was 21. This was his 3rd year as a teacher, and yet he still couldn't get used to the frantic emotions of kids. He swore his class wasn't like this when he was young, or maybe they were. Tell me. Your classmates. The boy spat out. Do you still catch up with them? I was just wondering because Chargebolt was in your class and he's my favorite pro. If you were a pro, you'd be my favorite, but Chargebolt takes the stage. I love that guy. Izuku's face dropped for a millisecond. If you were a pro, you'd be my favorite. Why did that hit him so hard? Pushing the thought to the back of his mind, Izuku looked to the side and chuckled. His student's passion for his former classmate was astonishing. Izuku sometimes forgot how much of an impact these guys were having on the youth. Denki? He asked. The boy's face lit up at the first name address. Yes. No way. The girl next to him scoffed. Nerd. Izuku sighed. Yeah, we talk sometimes. He stood straight and ruffled the kid's hair. You remind me of him. Yuji grinned wide, astonished. That's made my entire life. We have a similar quirk, so I try to follow his example directly. Izuku laughed again. The boy did, in fact, have a similar quirk. At his disposal, He could charge himself up and shoot an electric shot down whatever he touched. Izuku had filled multiple notebooks, as he did for every student, with different theories and improvements he planned to test with the kid that year. Well, in that case, Denki was a star student, he lied. The girl grinned, seeing through his falsities. Better start listening if you wanna be the next Chargebolt. Izuku laughed. The boy paled before nodding intensely. Good. Now go get lunch before the crowds swarm you. The two students gave Izuku a friendly salute, that of which he returned. The salute, welcome and greeting was a weird ritual that all of his classes had picked up over the past 3 years. On his first day, he entered the classroom, absolutely horrified and nervous, and for some reason gave a casual salute to the class. Izuku assumed that the students, due to their awe of him which they expressed every 5 freaking minutes, thought it was some sort of Deku characteristic that they should copy. It quickly became a trend to salute Mr. Deku as a welcome or goodbye. He was mortified when All Might did it one time they went out for lunch. But in all honesty, it warmed Izuku's heart. It reminded him that he wasn't irrelevant, that he still mattered to these kids. That he could make a difference. But sometimes, that difference wasn't enough. He finished his lunch, his afternoon classes, and the small amount of evening marking he had to catch up on. The moment he was done, he put his pen down, stood up from his desk, and made a rushed beeline towards the UA exit. Deku was an open book that nobody was able to read. Seeing the young teacher dart through the hallways was nothing to the staff, all of which already knew of his antics from his high school years. Deku was a good teacher. If he caused a little drama here and there was no issue around that. He was definitely much more confident and casual than he was in his first year of high school, however. Anybody who knew him before could notice how much his old classmates had rubbed off on him. A long, recognizable end of a scarf grabbed him from behind, and Izuku released a dramatic yelp as he was dragged back. The scarf lifted him from the ground, and he was left kicking his legs in the air like a child. He frowned. Izuku was longing for something that he physically couldn't explain to his capture. As much as he loved to talk, and Deku freaking loved to talk, he really wanted to get out of the eyeshot of Ua. That deep, familiar voice hit him like a truck. No running in the halls. Aizawa. Izuku groaned. It had taken Deku almost a year to discard the Mr. from the start of his name. Even despite his allowance, he refused to call him Shota. It just felt icky. The older man had to stop a grin from forming on his face. Izuku envied how deadpan he could be and fell into a practiced position once released by the scarf. I work here, he cried. Izuku gave a wide, childish smile and a famous salute to the man before continuing his leg down the hallway. Aizawa didn't even bother trying to ask about the rush. Izuku was long gone, and despite his love for his students, the kid was still a kid. When Principal Nezu himself came up with the idea of hiring Deku, nobody on the faculty board was against the idea. It was evident in everybody's mind that Izuku was young, and when he started he was only a year, if not a few months, older than the third years. But Izuku Midoriya had been forced to grow up from the moment he was given one for all. To say he was too young for something could be hypocritical. They sent him into war. He sure as hell could handle a class. It might have been the way he skipped a step as he rushed down the stairs. Or it might have been the way he completely discarded the stairs and jumped between the railings instead. But something about unexpected action soothed him tremendously. He might have not had a quirk, but he sure as hell had the muscular mass, strength, and skills that he built up to vessel one for all. His fighting techniques and natural strength didn't fade along with the embers. If that had been the case, his second and third years of UA would have been useless. Despite the entire idea of becoming a hero being simply quixotic, Izuku spent his final 2 years of high school adapting to his losses, and therefore, if it was socially acceptable, he could easily strut out onto the street and release his retired identity back into the wild. But it wasn't socially acceptable. As much as he didn't want to believe it, Izuku peaked when he was 16. Despite what he said to Yuji, he really didn't talk to the gang often, and part of him believed that he was nothing more than a candle of their past. He knew that wasn't right. He knew that they cared for him. But without projecting that care, how was Izuku supposed to accept it? They were busy. Busy being heroes. busy with a future that was supposed to wait for Deku. In his mind, every outcome of his friends' futures included Deku. Included him. He thought, sometimes, that such an idea was horribly selfish, but he couldn't help it. That was his dream. These thoughts and worries came in sharp waves that pinned Izuku to the ocean bed. No matter how he thrashed and screamed against the shards, they dug further into his skin, sinking him deeper into the thick sand. Izuku was drowning. He'd tried not to show that in class, but even in UA, the teaching schedule was bland. Every day was the same and so very different from the experience that he had at his student's age. The kids loved every second of it, but sometimes Izuku found himself wishing for something slightly more violent. Not towards the students, of course, but something he could get involved in. To sum things up, Izuku was bored. Bored and restless. So when he put on those black baggy cargos, when he changed into that black, hooded pullover and slung the tactical belt over his shoulders, when he pulled the lycra mask over his head with the upside-down, one-way vision, fabricated a stitched onto it, when he covered the mask with the pullover's hood and slipped into his boots, when he became a different person, he began to feel the air enter his lungs. Izuku knew that vigilantism was very illegal, but he had a way to justify it. See, vigilantes are classed as undocumented quirk users who take authority without legal jurisdiction. Deku had a hero license. Though he didn't use it, the hero course made him take the exam and, naturally, he passed. To add to this, Izuku didn't have a quirk. In modern society, vigilantes were literally defined to be quirk users. He knew this because he did a case study in his second year on the topic. If anything, Izuku could be taken down easily by somebody with a strong quirk, though he was never gonna let that happen. So, his theory was this: he had a license. He was quirkless, and he was helping society at the same time. How could any of that be illegal? And sure, theoretically this also meant that Izuku could just go out under the name of Deku, but the image of uproar that formed in his head at the idea was bitter. People wouldn't accept a quirkless hero, that's what Izuku thought anyway. If he had support gear, he could probably go Iron Man style. In that case, he'd likely be able to be a hero without any hassle, but how the hell was he going to afford that? He was a teacher. He spent way too much than he should have on the mask he wore for vigilantism, so an entire suit wasn't even an option. As well as this, he could only imagine the faces of the people he knew if he publicly went out without any support. Uraraka would be in his DMs, and the school would make him sign paperwork, and his mom would cry, and All Might would probably cry too. They'd all yap in his ear about his past and how they almost lost him before, as if he didn't almost lose them and as if he wasn't the one getting lost himself. He shivered. Vigilantism was the only option. Plus, he loved it. It reminded him of his youth, the time he was constantly on the run from All for One. Despite that era holding horrible memories of mental torment, it also made Izuku's heart race and blood run like it hadn't in years. When he jumped between rooftops and slid into alleyways, he felt alive. Thriving. It quickly became an addiction. He couldn't wait to get out of work so he could change into another outfit and suit up with weapons, ropes and knives, anything that he could easily use without having to learn or train with them over again. He'd patrol the streets into the late hours of the night, stopping smaller crimes that pros were either too negligent to notice or too busy to care about. On occasion, he'd stop a bigger villain. Izuku never really noticed how confident he was with hand-to-hand combat until he lost the quirk that basically made all of his punches tenfold. That, he assumed, was the outcome of his early months with One for All, and the fear of breaking his bones from just a single flick. He had to learn how to defend himself either way, so his physical combat was freaking amazing. During these vigilante sessions, Izuku finally found his guilty pleasure. The police took a while to catch on to his actions. He was smart enough to avoid security cameras and the public eye and always was clean with his work. It wasn't until he saw the news about 2 months into his shenanigans that he realized he was doing something very wrong. An important part of the hero course taught you about reports. For example, if a pro were to defeat a villain, that defeat in battle would have to be reported for data purposes by that same pro. Now, Izuku was defeating and tying up bad guys and just leaving them there with crossed fingers, hoping a hero would find and take them in. But, sometimes, nobody did. Izuku saw this disturbance in the news. Some innocent heroes were being blamed for their lousy work because it was assumed they defeated the bad guy and just left them. This tore Izuku's heart into a million pieces, damn his kind personality, and made him realize that he needed to change something before his work started doing more bad than good. So he began to sign off his actions with semi-permanent. Izuku was not breaking any more laws, spray paint and a capital A inside of a heart. The A was a tribute to his mask. He didn't purposely design the mask to have an A, but the pattern made the translucent material the perfect shape to be able to have full vision ahead of him without anyone on the outside seeing any part of his face. The heart meant nothing other than a sorry for the things he was doing wrong, because no matter how much he enjoyed it, part of his chest tinged at the idea of literally breaking the law. He had to remind himself of his theory that nothing he was doing was illegal more often than he liked. Izuku didn't mean for the sign-off to become a well-known symbol. Izuku didn't mean for the symbol to get plastered on t-shirts and merchandise nationwide. And Izuku sure as hell didn't mean to become the most wanted vigilante in Japan, in only a year. They called him Amora, meaning love, title due to the love heart he left after himself. And Amora quickly became a more important figure in Izuku's life than Deku himself. Amora was different. Nobody had ever allowed Izuku to act so freely, forcing him to stick by rules and regulations his entire damn life, which he barely did. So having Amora, a part of him that wasn't afraid to mess around. It was beautiful. The moment the mask was put on, both Izuku and Deku were gone. He realized over his first year of vigilantism that the idea of lawbreaking started to chip away at his walls of perfection, and he found himself in a battle between the police over who could piss each other off the most. Izuku's voice was muffled by the mask, which made it slightly deeper, and luckily, because everyone knew the voice of Deku, changed it significantly. The guilty pleasure of repeatedly ing with those above him in authority was so appealing and refreshing that he couldn't stop. He'd prevent a crime, catch a villain, wait around long enough for the cops to approach, and dip with a giggle or remark before they could even lay a finger on him. It was a game of cat and mouse, except Amora was the cat, and the mice were easily scared away. Izuku loved it, Deku loved it, Amora loved it, and the best part was the fact he wasn't even doing anything illegal. Evading the police could have been an issue, but that was the most entertaining part of Amora's patrols. Plus, assuming his theory was correct and didn't lack holes that he'd overseen, if they caught him, he could smugly pull out his hero license and they'd probably just give him a little smack on the hand. But he didn't want to be caught. Izuku, Deku, and Amora all just hoped that the pros wouldn't get too involved with the little game they were playing. If anything would cause Izuku an inconvenience, it would be a battle with a truly effective quirk. A year after the initial phone call, Tsukauchi was pleasantly surprised to see such a familiar face at the police station. Despite the frown and clenched fists, only good intentions radiated from the guy who was drawing many starstruck eyes from his coworkers. "I thought you weren't interested in the case." The man in front of him crossed his arms with a mix of anger and determination. Tsukauchi grinned. This might have been just what they needed. "He's stealing all my work," Katsuki growled. "Let me tear this damn guy apart." Chapter text. "Are you certain?" asked Tsukauchi. "I must admit, this is a big job to take on." Katsuki scoffed. Sat at the table in the detective's office, the blonde leant forward in his hero costume, planting his elbows stubbornly onto the surface. "Go over it once more. Let me think." "All right, well," he shuffled his papers, reading over the notes. "Amora is a daily issue. It's less about the stuff that he does and more about the public image he's gaining. We're worried that he'll inspire more vigilantes to rise and do similar unauthorized acts of violence, if he hasn't already. However," he sighed, "I lowered the priority of this case a long time ago. As much as we want him off the streets, the police simply have too many other issues on their plate to chase somebody we can't catch. When stuff comes up, we add to the file, but if there was enough to go on for a true capture, then we would have done it already." "So you've gotten nowhere," Katsuki stated. Tsukauchi rolled his eyes. "We have the locations in which he's most active, but that's really it. As I said, This isn't a priority case, but it sure annoys everybody in the precinct whenever it's mentioned. There are just too many empty spaces in our details that I don't appreciate risking my men's lives over. We don't know if Amora would be violent if he came in contact with officers, we don't even know his quirk. It can be assumed that it's strong, considering how he easily detains criminals, but the unpredictability of the situation makes me worry. With a firm nod, Katsuki crossed his arms and leaned back into his chair. Now that he was there, staring intently at the guy who seemed really fed up about the loser running around on the streets, he felt like he couldn't back out of this. The first time that Tsukauchi had approached Katsuki about the topic, his answer was a very confident and swift no. Dynamite's schedule was busy, too busy to chase around some anti-hero that was causing no real inconvenience for him. Had it been an easy case, one where he simply had to go and detain the guy, he likely would have taken the job. But Tsukauchi made it very clear how little they had on the Vigilante, and how difficult he was to even get close to. Bakugo wasn't really into wild goose chases. Plus, at that point, the guy wasn't even doing anything wrong. Katsuki was sure that when the detective walked away, he'd hear nothing more about the whole mess. Boy, was he wrong. Over the coming year, he only saw more and more content dedicated towards the criminal. News reports, compilations of admiration, support groups. This guy had caught attention, more attention than Katsuki was happy with. His work was well practiced and adequate, but every call and mission that came to the Dynamite Agency was cancelled by the time the hero even stepped foot in the vicinity. Bakugo hadn't become a hero to watch a vigilante do the work. He wanted to do it himself. Frankly, it pissed him off. The didn't even show his face, and his nickname Amora was fan-made and unofficial. The awe surrounding the name bitterly reminded him of Stain, not in the sense of evil, but in the sense of others following in his footsteps regarding the idea of taking action into their own hands. From what he'd seen, Amora wasn't a killer. He was barely even an anti-hero. But, no matter how well he did his job, Amora was an unlicensed guy with an unknown quirk partaking in illegal acts. If Katsuki had to go through all that shit in UA, and this guy got to do it without any prior training, that was more than enough reason to hold a grudge. And the whole stealing my job thing really pissed him off. I'll take it from you. Tsukauchi's mouth slacked open. Seriously. Katsuki growled. You think I'm joking around? Can you blame me? He said. I'm not one to give up on cases, but this one took at least 20 years off my lifespan. My agency has grown recently, so I have enough interns to send out if I'm needed, said Katsuki. There's just something about this guy that's pissing me off. Is it the fact he beats you to the job? Off. I'm serious. Tsukauchi raised his hands in defense. Katsuki paused momentarily, thinking. The man had a point. Since he was a kid, he was for competition. His mom would often use it as a manipulation scheme to get him to do chores. I bet I could wash the dishes better than you. You're on, Hag. Even though there were 3 pros above Dynamite in the ranks, he didn't feel motivated to compete with them. As long as he could keep Shoto slightly beneath him, he was happy. But with Amora, something was compelling him towards victory when presented with the challenge he projected. I'll have the bastard in handcuffs by tomorrow. Katsuki stood up with a heavy stomp of his feet. Just you wait. Picking up the small amount of notes that the detective already had, he nodded and turned to leave the room. Behind him, an unconvinced voice muttered, Sure you will, kid. And Katsuki had to stop himself from saying never mind and throwing the sheets in the man's face. The Dynamite Agency. Katsuki had tried to get his full hero name licensed on the building, but it wouldn't fit on the damn sign. Was located in Minato, Tokyo. Though there was criminal activity all over Japan, areas such as Tokyo and Musudafu saw the most drama. Despite being able to use his explosions for flight, Katsuki would rather not use up energy before he even got to the scene. His apartment was still in Musudafu for the sake of his family living there. He grew up there and went to UA there, so it only felt right to live there too. It was only a short distance from his apartment to his agency, but the top floor of the skyscraper was limited to private, Katsuki Bakugo only use. His apartment was small, so he filled the top floor of the tower with gym equipment and training areas. There was also a sofa and TV area in case a patrol ed him up and he chose to stay the night. It was on that same sofa where Pro-Hero Dynamite reconsidered his entire life choices from the day he was born. Tsukauchi wasn't lying when he said he had nothing on Amora. On his way up, he'd given word to a few of his staff to keep an eye out for any mention of Amora in the news and send it directly to his personal phone. Even though he was confident with doing this alone, he was aware of how much of a challenge this could bring. Amora was careful about this sort of thing, that was evident. The was only seen when he wanted to be seen, and that damn symbol was a trademark of mischief and annoyance. But the trademark itself was Katsuki's first move. If he could track where they were, and figure out a pattern that the cops weren't able to see, then maybe he could run into the guy and stop him sooner rather than later. The police, obviously, had already pinpointed the location of Amora sightings, but they hadn't created any theories surrounding the locations. Katsuki couldn't blame them. Amora worked mainly in western Tokyo, however, sometimes he was seen towards the center and in places such as Shibuya. There were many sightings pinpointed in Musudafu as well. However, as sporadic as they were, the dates joined in such a way that Amora would do a singular route in a small area each day. Now, this guy may well have had a rotor to spread his vigilantism easily, however, on weekdays the routes were much smaller and the areas that Amora had covered were lesser than on weekends. Bakugo was yet to discover the times of these reports. That was something he really needed to know, but Tsukauchi had already told him about that. Considering how hard it was to even see the guy, it was equally as hard to know what time he acted. A lot of the criminals he tied up were unconscious and, from time to time, were even dropped at the police station's front door. Nobody could truly confirm the times when Amora acted. One thing he could see by the dates was the distances expanding by day. One day, he'd be focused in western Musudafu. Next, he'd move more centrally. This worked consecutively until the 2 solid days in a row that he spent in Tokyo. Katsuki frowned, pulling his phone out and typing the dates of such a rotor into his phone. His eyes widened as he noticed a solid pattern dictated by each day of the week. Monday, western Musudafu. Tuesday, central Musudafu. Wednesday, northern Musudafu. Thursday, southern Musudafu. Friday, east Musudafu. Saturday and Sunday, Tokyo. And repeat. Katsuki dropped his phone and flicked through the notes given by Tsukauchi. This topic had been discussed, a pattern dictated by days, however, it was a tiny segment that was deemed irrelevant by outlying events. He pondered over that for a moment, fuming at the idea of his realization being futile, but then it hit him. The guys who wrote these notes were cops, not heroes. Amora must act with a hero-like mindset for his vigilantism, and Dynamite shared such a mindset, being a pro and all. As the cops noticed these outliers as statistical evidence that dictated truth, Katsuki only saw the outliers as helpless cries that couldn't be ignored. Pleas for help that throw you off track, but you have a duty to answer. Being a hero meant disobeying the status quo and going off your usual rotor if somebody needed you, and Amora clearly had these thoughts on the odd occasion he changed his location. That was a conclusion only a hero could come to. He smirked. Today's date. Sunday. It was Monday tomorrow, which meant Amora would be in western Musudafu. Dynamite's patrols were based in Tokyo. There were enough heroes in Musudafu as it was, and Tokyo had an extremely high population, therefore the crime rate increased with it. However, just like Amora, Dynamite's status quo would have to change for the time being. Sending a text to his senior staff, he informed them to change his diary location to Musudafu for the upcoming 5 days. Amora may have had fun toying with the police, but now he would have to deal with a pro-hero on his wimpy little tail. Bastard, he yelled to the ceiling. Now he would have to deal with Katsuki Bakugo. Shibuya, Tokyo. As he tied ropes around the criminal's wrists, he winced as the once threatening guy thrashed under his grip, crying like a baby. Embarrassing, dude, said the vigilante. Shut up, you pest. He hissed, spitting with his words. The criminal's quirk was water-based, shooting some kind of pressurized stream from his mouth. At first, Izuku was rather taken aback by such a promising quirk, but it took him only a matter of seconds to analyze the fatal flaws in the man's usage. The force of the water was so strong that neither his mouth nor tongue was able to aim it. To direct the stream, the guy had to physically move his entire body, which limited the control he had over defending his arms and legs. If he wanted to talk, he had to stop the quirk completely, and this guy really enjoyed the game of trying to yap Izuku to death. Izuku, with no effort at all, was able to mount the wall and take the guy down from above. Once he was grounded, his quirk only worked in one direction, and he gave up trying to use it the moment he got straddled. To his dismay, Izuku was drenched from the spray that flew from the initial stream. At least it didn't hit me, he thought. Would have gone through like a lightsaber. I didn't want this. Izuku tilted his head. They do rehab for this kind of stuff. No, he growled. I didn't want you. Dramatically, Izuku balled his hand into a fist and pretended to stab his heart. Ouch, man, I thought we were close. Best friends, even. Oh, cry yourself to sleep, he retorted. The masked man rolled his eyes. Ironic considering I can see your tears pouring. Number 4 was supposed to be here. Damn, teased Izuku. How many girls are you seeing? Am I not your number 1? He tightened the ropes and the man squealed. Dynamite, where is he? Izuku rolled his eyes. Here we go again. Dynamite Kachan was based in Tokyo, and though he never saw the guy when he visited, villains and criminals were intent on having a run-in with the guy. Izuku completely blamed the pro for starting this trend on his own. Kachan talked big about himself, openly challenged negativity to come at him when on TV or any other media source, and then had a bunch of crazy people feel the intense urge to take him down. Out of the top pros, Kachan probably made the most enemies and had the most hits on his head. Izuku was genuinely worried sometimes and considered calling the guy up to sort him out. But he never did. He never spoke to Kachan along with his entire class in general. They'd all moved on, grown up, and had been doing their own thing for more than 3 years. Izuku admired his friends, Kachan primarily. Kachan had become everything he always said he would, and his chest felt warm and proud when he thought about his friends' accomplishments. Even though they'd parted on good terms, probably the best terms they'd ever been on, they had a treacherous past, and Izuku told himself that he had no interest in seeking him out. He swore that he didn't. But Izuku's luck was never known to be on his side. Chapter text. Izuku had lost his danger sense with One for All, but sometimes, just sometimes, he felt the same tingle in the back of his head that told him something was wrong. It was likely a coincidence. His past had left him awfully paranoid throughout most situations, despite hiding such feelings well, so even friendly things started to look malicious to the guy. But there were some cases where his sixth sense worked too well to be coincidental. For example, the same Sunday that he fought the guy with the water quirk, Izuku vowed to get an early night before teaching the next morning, and went to lock up his apartment. He slammed down the windows, locked the front door, and then pulled up a chair in the hallway and sat, staring intently at the doorknob he just secured. Had anyone been there and seen Izuku sitting in the hallway, extremely tense and eyes sharpened towards his apartment's front door, they would have thought he'd finally lost it. But something was screaming in his mind, somebody shouting at him to watch the door. To be ready for action. To not take his eyes off the wooden structure and metal framing. The buzz was so deafening that Izuku had no option other than to comply. And he was glad that he did. Just before midnight, a loud crash resounded through the hallway and the door that Izuku was fervently watching gave way to a bulky man. Kitchen knife in hand, the man's eyes widened with a unique joy as he saw Izuku, who had quickly discarded the chair and charged towards him with murderous intent. The man's eyes burned with a hunger that jolted Izuku back to his first year of high school. The raw, visceral hatred reminded him of All for One and Shigaraki. Izuku shook his head, blinking rapidly to clear the disturbing memories, and swiftly assumed a fighting stance as the man lunged at him with a blade. Dodging the initial swing, Izuku jumped aside, narrowly avoiding a second strike by ducking, the knife leaving a long gouge in the wall. The man's quirk was clearly strength-based, and Izuku felt a pang of longing for One for All. However, he recalled the grueling non-quirk training he had endured since he lost the quirk, and felt a wave of fortitude engulf him. Gritting his teeth, he channeled that training into his movements. In the midst of his thoughts, the man managed to land a solid punch on Izuku's face, and he winced at the sudden flow of pain. Fueled by a surge of anger, Izuku retaliated with a powerful counter-strike. The man, stunned by Izuku's strength, staggered backward, crashing into the opposite wall of the narrow hallway. Seizing the opportunity, Izuku rushed forward, wrenching the knife from the man's grasp and tossing it out of reach. The knife embedded itself in another wall with a resounding thud, leaving a streak of paint in its wake. Izuku cringed at the damage but refocused on the task at hand, determined to restrain the dazed assailant and end the confrontation. "What do you want?" he yelled, pinning the man's head to the wall and using his whole body force to keep him still. The guy didn't answer. Instead, he chuckled. Izuku, exhausted from his long patrol in Tokyo and furious that he didn't get an early night, saw a red aura fade over his iris. Pulling the man's head back, he slammed it forward into the wall and increased his volume with sprinkles of malice. "Answer me." Again, no answer. Izuku shook the man roughly, his anger boiling over as he muttered fierce, angry statements into his ear. Each violent jostle was a release of his pent-up frustration. When he finally pulled the man back, he took a closer look and was startled by the sight of his limp, unresponsive face. It hit him with a cold shock. In a sudden wave of panic, Izuku let go, stumbling backwards as the man's unconscious body slumped to the ground with a heavy thud. The sound reverberated through the hallway, and Izuku stood there, frozen and overwhelmed by the weight of his actions, his breathing coming in short, shaky bursts. "Oh my God! Oh 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 my God!" He'd lost control. He'd lost control, something that he hadn't done in a long time. That wasn't him, that wasn't something Deku would do. Izuku would be lying if he didn't previously worry about his vigilante lifestyle leaking into his casual actions. Every night for the past year, entire days on weekends, he'd spent on the streets fighting. At first, he pulled his punches, but over time, as he grew more accommodated and comfortable where he stood, he grew more violent and harsh with his attacks. He never meant to. God, he never meant to. But in order to do his job, he had to knock out the criminal either way. Sometimes he hit them too hard. Harder than they deserved. But he'd never kill anybody. He'd never kill anybody. Never. Although it all began as a method to soothe his boredom and sense of futility, Izuku quickly realized that punching out his anger and stress was a very useful tactic. It was funny in a way. Izuku often condemned Kachan for having those exact feelings in high school, but now he was the one fighting away his burdens. As time passed, his nightmares only grew more vivid and gruesome, and the entire idea of hitting instead of crying turned horribly appealing. Had he never conjured the idea to become a Mora, he would have stuck to good old therapy. Had he never conjured the idea to become a Mora, he wouldn't have picked up on the violent tendencies that he used to hate. Had he never conjured the idea to become a Mora, Izuku Midoriya's temperance would have been solid. Now, he grew angry quicker than he liked. A Mora had altered Izuku, and as he stood in that hallway, face sore and melancholy, he knew that there was no going back. Then what happened? All Might asked, concern lacing his voice. Izuku was laid unprofessionally on the sofa in the UA staff room. Rubbing his temples, he tried desperately to avoid touching the nasty bruise under his left eye. All Might and Present Mike had pulled up chairs opposite the sofa to listen to the younger teacher, whereas Aizawa stood a few feet away in front of the computers. He didn't look at Izuku, staring down at the monitor in front of him, but it was obvious that he was listening in. Called the cops, Izuku yawned. He didn't get much sleep after the entire ordeal the night before. Would have dragged the guy to the station myself, but my door was knocked down. Didn't fancy getting robbed. You just don't get a break, huh, kid, Mike said. Well, it's not like I can't expect this kind of thing. Izuku ran a hand through his green hair. But still, All Might added, probably the unhappiest person in the room. You shouldn't be ambushed in your own home. He's right, Midoriya, said Aizawa. All eyes turned towards the man who was previously silent. You made a lot of enemies in the past. Just because you defeated the main one doesn't mean they're all gone. All Might nodded. It's a blessing that this was only the first attack. Izuku went silent, biting his lip. The three others in the room widened their eyes in anticipation, picking up on something unsaid. He looked down. The room turned to chaos. Kid, Aizawa said, raising his voice through the noise. I swear. Hey, Izuku sat up, panicking. No, hear me out. It was only a few times on the street. This is the first time somebody's come to my house. All Might looked horrified. You've been attacked on the street. You haven't. He shook his head. The craze over me lowered as soon as you came into the picture, the man admitted. I had a run-in with Stain once, but he just chatted to me. Stain, Izuku cried. Even Aizawa looked shocked at that one. You can't tell me off for keeping a few attacks to myself when you held hands with the hero killer. I'm a grown man. So am I. I'm 21. A wide grin consumed Izuku's face when All Might went silent from defeat. Mike coughed. In his defense, he can legally go out and get hammered whenever he wants now. Exactly, Izuku chimed. No, he can't, Aizawa hissed. Don't encourage that, Hazashi. Sorry, Mom, but in all seriousness, continued Aizawa, I don't think you realize how well-known you truly are. The fact your address must be leaked is a safety issue that I don't think you should ignore. All Might hummed. I agree. He leant closer to the younger boy. Between us, in your second year, there was talk about the dormitory plan being discarded. Had that been the case, we would have approached your mother with the idea of a witness protection scheme. Izuku's mouth slacked open. You're kidding. Aizawa over there. All Might nodded in the man's direction. In response, he simply looked to the ground. Was adamant to put you in protective housing even after your graduation. But, as you weren't a minor any longer, I knew you wouldn't accept it. You were right. I know. At 18, Izuku made the difficult decision to move out of his mom's apartment, leaving the Heights Alliance behind in the same week. It was a choice driven by a deep concern for his mother's well-being, as the paranoia gnawing at his psyche had reached an all-time high. The constant fear of danger lurking around every corner made it easier for him to focus on protecting only his own safety, rather than bearing the weight of his mother's as well. But there was more to it than just fear. A part of him longed for a fresh start, a new chapter that was his own. Watching all of his friends step into their roles as pro-heroes had become a heavy burden on his heart. If he could create something similar, a new beginning in his own space, perhaps he could ease the pressure that came with seeing everyone else move forward while he felt stuck. Moving out wasn't just about safety, it was about finding a way to stand on his own, to carve out his own path in the shadow of his friends' successes. It was also instrumental in the coming years following the birth of Amora. Izuku stared at All Might with a sympathetic smile, his ears straining to catch the next words from his former teacher. The familiar cadence of a sentence reached him, but something was off. None of the mouths in his line of sight were moving. A frown tugged at his brow as confusion hit him. Was I really hit that hard yesterday? And then, it hit him. That voice. That unmistakable, cocky voice. Your door's fixed, nerd. Izuku had heard the expression, my soul jumped out of my body, before, but it wasn't until that very moment that he truly understood it. Panic surged through him as the unexpected noise echoed in his right ear, his heart racing in a wild, erratic rhythm. Instinct took over before his mind could catch up, and he found himself shouting, "Oh my God!" As he flinched violently, in a flash, he was on his feet, spinning around and dropping into a fighting stance, ready to confront whatever had snuck up on him. A soft laugh from behind cut through the tension, and Izuku's wide eyes took in the sight of Aizawa with an amused smirk tugging at his lips. But the real shock came when he turned further. He hadn't even heard him coming. There, sitting casually on the sofa where Izuku had been just moments before, one arm draped lazily across the backrest, was Kacchan. Cladded head to toe in his hero outfit, his look was slightly different from what he last saw in the flesh, but that face, that smirk, was unforgettable. His blonde hair covered his eyes in a messy fashion as if he'd been on the move all day, and he glared at Izuku with daggers that made his stomach twist in a way he knew all too well. The young teacher froze, loosening his limbs and dropping his arms to his sides in defeat. The sight of Kacchan was startling, to say the least, but not unwelcome. It was just unexpected. The two of them had come a long way, and while the surprise of seeing him there caught Izuku off guard, it wasn't fear or anger that pulsed through him. Just sheer shock. Kacchan, Izuku choked. Still with that damn pet name. Katsuki teased. You're ridiculous. What are you doing here? Izuku cried. Katsuki raised his eyebrows at the slightly frustrated look on the guy's face. TCH. A frown flickered across Izuku's face as Kacchan abruptly stood up. Without a word or a second glance, the hero headed straight for the door, his steps purposeful and unyielding. Deku, follow, he ordered, voice flat and commanding. Izuku's frustration flared, and he threw his arms up in exasperation, bristling at the way Kacchan barked orders as if he were some obedient pet. But despite the irritation simmering beneath the surface, Izuku quickly waved a hasty goodbye to All Might, Mike, and Aizawa before sprinting after the hero, who had already put a considerable distance between them in just a few strides. Catching up to his friend, he took a profound breath before talking. So, why was this so awkward? Number 4 now, huh? What do you know of Amora? What? It took every fiber in Izuku's body to stop him from freezing on the spot. Had Kacchan missed the teacher's apprehension, it would have been a miracle. The chill that had shot down his spine was bone-crushing, paralyzing. There was no way he knew, right? On his patrols, Amora had never even seen Dynamite. Hell, even Izuku hadn't seen Dynamite, and he was doing hero-related activities every day for his job. But Kacchan was smart. Kacchan saw things before others did. Suddenly, every mistake Amora may have made on his patrols swarmed Izuku's mind, sirens blaring, deafening. He felt pinned to the ground. Not much. Izuku turned to give Kacchan a warm smile as he walked by his side. Why do you ask? Kacchan shot him a glare. I have a job, but no ing material. A job, Izuku repeated in his head. A job. What kind of job? He tried. Classified. Izuku looked genuinely offended at such words. Seriously, who am I even gonna tell? My students. Wouldn't shock me, Katsuki shrugged. Damn pushover. If not for the fact that Izuku could sense the absence of malice in Kacchan's words, and thanks to the maturity he had gained since he was 15, that insult might have stung. But now, with years of growth behind him, Izuku understood the dynamic better. He could see it for what it was, a familiar, rough-edged camaraderie. He often found himself bantering with his coworkers in the same way he once did with Kacchan, recognizing that beneath the harsh words was a bond forged through years of shared experiences. Kacchan never meant any harm. But still, the familiar vocabulary didn't tear his mind from the lingering topic. Shut up, chuckled Izuku. Katsuki rolled his eyes. Do you know anything or not? As a matter of fact, he said. Katsuki's face lit up slightly at the suggested ownership of knowledge. Izuku looked to the ground. I know nothing. Of course not. In a desperate attempt to change the subject, Izuku coughed. How did you know my door was fixed? He asked, turning to look at the blonde. Or, more accurately, the wall. He was gone. One moment, Kacchan was standing there, and the next, he had vanished without a trace. Izuku's breath caught in his throat as he whipped his head around, scanning the hollow hallway in disbelief. Kacchan had always been sneaky, but this was something else entirely. The sudden emptiness where he'd been standing gnawed at Izuku, leaving him with an unsettling mix of frustration and unease. Amora could take notes, he thought, trying to mask his growing anxiety. Izuku's fists clenched at his sides, the reality of the situation sinking in. Kacchan had come and gone in the blink of an eye, leaving behind more questions than answers. It wasn't just the abruptness of his disappearance that bothered Izuku. It was the fact that Kacchan was clearly invested in Amora, and Izuku had no idea about it. Have the police given up? Kacchan had never been one to get entangled in other people's business without a good reason, and if he was investigating Amora, it meant he had probably figured out more than Izuku had hoped. That alone made him angry. He didn't know why. He didn't usually like to get angry with Kacchan, but this wasn't his emotions bubbling to the surface. Amora was taking control here. The room seemed to close in around Izuku Amora, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He really liked Kacchan and admired him more than anyone, but the thought of him finding out the truth filled him with a cold, gnawing fear. Fear and fury. The silence of the hallway only amplified the weight of his thoughts. As Izuku Amora stood there, alone with his racing mind, he felt the intense urge to suit up, checking his watch and shivering at the 3 hours he had left of work. He knew then. His little game of freedom had suddenly turned much more dangerous. That night's patrol would be interesting. Chapter text. For a solid few hours, Katsuki had completely forgotten that Deku had a full daytime job as a teacher. He didn't know what to expect when he turned up at the nerd's apartment, maybe a suit-covered hero, one for all radiating through his arms as he beamed with energy and determined radiance. A quixotic vision, he knew. But he sure as hell didn't predict to be faced with a wide-eyed cop and a busy repairman. Traversing the hallway, he stopped where the two were staring and squinted his eyes, attempting to piece apart the situation before any words were said. It was then he learned two things. 1. This cop could waffle for Japan, and 2. Deku's home had been broken into the night before. Katsuki didn't call himself the overreacting type, nor did he class himself as at all dramatic. However, the stabbing pain in his chest and the alarm bells circulating his thoughts were so overwhelming that he had to bite his tongue to keep his reaction civil. The pro knew more than anyone how well Deku could hold his own. Even after losing his quirk, Katsuki had to keep his guard up during training to avoid being completely flattened by the guy. But, despite easily being able to revisit Deku regarding his case when he finished work, he chose to march straight to the site in question and see him without wasting any time. He told himself that he was desperate for answers. Deku was smart and perceptive, analyzing heroes and company for fun over boredom. The chances of him having a page or two on Amora were high. But part of him also just wanted to make sure he was okay. And when he got there, he saw Deku with his bruised-ass face and a shit-eating grin, and he felt like he was 17 again. Fighting Shigaraki. Bleeding out on the floor. Dying. Dead. Alive. Fighting Shigaraki. Bleeding out on the floor. Stop it. Deku. Follow. Deku looked tired. Exhausted even, not just physically but emotionally too. Katsuki wasn't the best with feelings, but even he could notice the stark contrast between Izuku Midoriya and whoever the hell was walking in the hallway with him. The way he frowned more than he smiled. And the way his usual apologetic attitude had turned more belittling and confident. The stoic coldness of his features and the tensing of his limbs at the mention of certain things made Katsuki feel tense himself. He tried not to stare at the scar on the side of his face. Something had changed about the shitty Deku he grew up with, and it stunned him completely. Was it age? Had the finally matured? Shut up, chuckled Izuku. An empty chuckle. A chuckle that had been pulled from the depths of purgatory, foreign to the body it escaped from. No, was this something deeper? So, he bolted. Change wasn't Katsuki's forte, and, despite the weirdness in his attitude, Deku was generally unpredictable and really off sometimes. His mission wasn't to be a therapist. He didn't want to think about emotions for too long and get pulled under by somebody else's lack of buoyancy. Plus, he still stuck with the hope that others from Class A were seeing Deku often. Hopefully, they'd already noticed what he had, and they were sorting it. But what if they hadn't? What if? No, Katsuki scolded himself. Because, realistically, that wouldn't make sense. Why would only he pick up something that losers such as Icy Hot hadn't? The damn half and half was practically humping Deku's leg in high school. There was no way it hadn't been noticed. And, more importantly, Katsuki had bigger fish to fry than a grumpy tadpole. Sinking deeper and deeper into the sand, his lungs collapsed beneath the pressure of the ocean bed, choking him. This wasn't a new feeling. He'd grown so accommodated to the sand over the years that it began to mold around his limbs, not a single grain feeling fresh or new. But still, the sand was intrusive. It dug deeper into his skin as if it were on a scavenger hunt, searching for something that he was simply unable to protect. A voice called out to him from above the surface. It was floating, high in the sky, yet the water rippled in front of his eyes and stopped him from distinguishing the figure. He blinked, desperately trying to break free, but the sand had learnt all of his moves and accustomed to the way he fought with ease. No matter what he did, it was useless. The blurs broke apart, spreading into many different colored dots. One pink and brown. One black and orange, one red and white. More and more appeared until he could no longer keep track, but he could hear their distorted yells and picked up only malice within their tones. Intense hatred reached the ocean bed, blowing the sand and covering his eyes with the hostile grains. Without sight, the yells grew louder, until a very soft, feminine voice rose from the ground. "Izuku," she said, "honey, are you there?" Pain ripped his eyes open and in a flash, he found himself once again. Or, at least, pieces of himself. Knees drawn to his chest, he watched the light from his phone show a selfie of him and his mom from the previous Christmas, distorted by the distance between himself and the item. It was thrown a few feet across the alleyway he was sitting in, and he shivered at the sound of his mom's concerned voice. Brushing a gloved hand over his masked face, he pulled his hood firmer over his head and reached for the phone. He was calling his mom. He must have freaked out in the alleyway over something and called his mom for comfort. God, he thought. I really am weak. But what triggered it? He couldn't recall anything bad happening since he began his patrol, and the vision itself was recurring and unexplainable. It had been a long patrol, the moon being far above him in the dark sky, but nothing particularly memorable had occurred. Those blobs, who were they? And what had Izuku done to them to cause such hatred and animosity? He shivered. Despite the amount of times he'd sunk into that sand, nobody had ever interacted with him before. Usually, he was alone. He pulled his mask above his nose. Raising the phone to his ear, he cheered, "Sorry, Mom." A relieved sigh sounded from the other end. "But dial." "Goodness, Izuku," she cried. "I was this close to calling All Might." What would All Might be able to do? He groaned, before slapping a hand over his mouth in disbelief. Did I just insult All Might? Seriously, what was wrong with him? Are you sure you're okay? Inko's tone had tensed, probably equally as disturbed by Izuku's narcissism. "I'm fine, Mom, I swear." "Okay, honey, talk to you tomorrow." Despite being the initial caller, Izuku put the phone down first. He shoved it into his cargoes, readjusted his shoulder belt and pushed himself up from the ground. His legs were shaky and tired, but he shoved the feeling to the back of his mind, instead approaching the first fire escape in sight and bitterly starting to climb it. With one single bat of his hand, his mask was pulled completely down once more. Izuku didn't know why, but ever since his run-in with Kachan that afternoon he'd felt horribly, disheveled. He wasn't sure whether he was angry over the briefness of the interaction, or the topic of which they were walking about, or the lack of sleep he'd had all day, but either way, it was all too unnerving. Seeing the blonde had catalyzed built-up emotions that he'd been suppressing for years. By doing so, he failed to push the intense feelings back down. He'd seen his class on TV, sure. And sometimes, the occasional text was sent his way. But a part of him dreaded seeing them in the flesh in case he had this kind of reaction. Whenever he looked in the mirror and stared at that unmissable scar on the cheek, he was overwhelmed by the past. When he looked at his rough and calloused hands, he felt equally as pained and tortured. He couldn't face his friends with such a delicate aura. Amora helped with that. Amora helped Izuku with a lot of things. His skin was completely covered, so the scars and indents could be seen by nobody. The mask distorted his voice just enough to make him sound a bit different. And he saw everything through another person's eyes, Amora's eyes. He felt as though he could do anything. Be anything. The trauma and sadness that followed Izuku Midoriya was erased as he changed into a different person. When the mask was on, Izuku was left in the past. Deku was gone. Only Amora stood. When Amora finally reached the rooftop, the city below sprawled out like a vast, living map, its lights flickering like distant stars in the dark. He moved with deliberate calm towards the ledge of the skyscraper, each step precise and measured, until he stood at the very edge, his boots inches from the drop. The height would make most men's stomachs churn, but not Amora. His legs remained steady, unfazed by the dizzying void beneath him. The wind surged around him, a powerful force that whipped at his hood, the fabric pulled against his head. The noise of it flapping filled his ears, a constant, chaotic rhythm that drowned out the city's distant hum below. And yet, even with the wind's roar, he felt it, a subtle shift in the air, a presence behind him that was as audacious as it was inevitable. The city lights reflected off the glass of the buildings around him, casting long shadows and sharp glints across the rooftop. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light bathing the scene in a ghostly glow as if the world itself was holding its breath. Amora remained on the ledge, a solitary figure framed against the night, his silhouette blending into the darkness. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he began to sit down, the wind still tugging at his body. His hand drifted towards the hilt of the blade concealed beneath the folds of his pullover. He dangled his legs down to the void below, watching cars zoom by with little regard for their illegal speed. The presence began to draw nearer, careful and cautious. A type of stealth that Izuku never would have noticed himself, but Amora picked up with ease, knowing exactly who and what was coming for him. He hid the dagger in his sleeve and sighed heavily. "Just sit down, you big oaf," Amora said, patting the ground beside him without even bothering to turn around. The sound of footsteps came to an abrupt halt. Amora smirked, knowing he'd caught his would-be attacker off guard. "Seat's getting cold," he added, his voice calm, almost teasing. "You bastard," Dynamite hissed through clenched teeth. "Stop acting like such a smartass. You're the one who tried sneaking up on me," Amora replied casually as if discussing the weather. He could hear the hum of Dynamite's grenadier bracers charging up, the crackling energy and the man's labored, angry breaths were more than enough warning for Amora to dodge. Yet, he didn't move a muscle. He remained seated, unflinching, with his legs dangling over the edge of the building, as if he were completely unaware of the imminent danger. "Do you have a death wish?" Dynamite shouted, his voice grating with frustration. Why was he always shouting? Amora lowered his head slightly, his feet swinging in the open air beneath him. "No, I'm not interested in fighting you, number 4. Dynamite stepped closer, his shadow looming over Amora. "Cry me a river, I'm fighting you, whether you like it or not. Seriously, you're just gonna blast me off the roof?" "Yes," Amora chuckled, shaking his head. "Geez, big guy, you're even dumber than you look." "You," Dynamite roared, firing a blast just inches from Amora's head. The force of the explosion sent debris scattering, but Amora didn't so much as flinch. "You know you're wanted, right? This shit you do is illegal," Dynamite snarled as if it were some great revelation. "See if I care." Amora shrugged, his tone as light as ever. Then, like the entire conversation bored him, he sighed. "And god damn it, will you just sit down already?" "No, what?" yelled the pro. "Did your mom drop you as a kid? Why the would I want to sit next to you? We could become BFFs." Dynamite ignored him. "You're gonna come with me, or I'll blast you off this damn roof." "Don't even test that theory." Amora grinned, visible through the words. "Oh, don't worry, I trust you. Get up." "No, get thee up," growled Dynamite. To the hero's horror, Amora let out a childlike whimper, turning to face the hero but not yet standing. That was the first time Dynamite had seen the front of the Vigilante, and the upside-down A on his mask was more jarring than he thought. "Can you?" He feigned anxiety. "Can you hold my hand? I'm scared of heights." Though it couldn't be seen, Amora was smiling under the mask. Silence. A heavy, loaded breath. And even the rats on the rooftop could notice the snap in Dynamite's gaze. Amora knew the pro would regret that. The moment the bracers released their explosion, he could almost taste the regret in the air, a bitter scent that made his pulse quicken with anticipation. From the second the blast tore through the area, Amora felt a familiar, electrifying thrill course through him. The pro had made a mistake, a delicious, irredeemable mistake. As soon as Amora vanished from sight, he knew he'd won the first round of their twisted game. The first of many. Dynamite was smarter than he looked, Amora would give him that much. The hero had clearly done his homework, likely picking apart the careful routine Amora had crafted over weeks of patrols. It was almost flattering, really. The hero's ability to find him on this particular rooftop, so far removed from prying eyes, meant that Dynamite wasn't just here to play hero, he was here for something personal. That only made it all the more exciting. Ever since Izuku's encounter with Kacchan earlier that day, he'd been preparing. He had known then that this was inevitable. Izuku admired Kacchan but Amora felt nothing for him. Amora felt nothing for anyone. Kacchan Dynamite had dared to stand in his way, to try and confine him to a life of rules and restrictions. Izuku Amora couldn't allow that, not now, not ever. So, While Dynamite wasted his energy on futile attacks, Amora was already a step ahead, his mind working through scenarios faster than any normal person could comprehend. He had left behind a little parting gift. Where Amora had once sat on the ledge, there was now a piece of paper, fluttering slightly in the breeze. It was pinned to the ground with the dagger that had been concealed in his sleeve, sharp and gleaming under the pale moonlight. The paper bore a simple message, a phone number, a series of digits that could lead to endless possibilities, or perhaps just one, the beginning of a challenge, a game of wits and will. It was a declaration, a statement that this wasn't over. Far from it. Amora had laid down the gauntlet, daring Kacchan to pick it up, to engage in a battle that would test more than just their strength. If Kacchan wanted to tear apart his freedom, Izuku Amora wasn't just going to resist, he was going to make it a nightmare. Because to Izuku Amora, this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was an intricate game, a dark and exhilarating dance where the lines between right and wrong blurred until they were nothing more than a distant memory. And in that twisted reality, where only the best and the strongest would emerge victorious, Amora was determined to be the last one standing. Deku couldn't do it in high school, so Amora knew he would have to avenge that weakness tenfold. Game on, Blasty. Chapter text. The next day, he didn't call his mom. As his alarm blared through the room, Izuku couldn't find the strength to pull himself out of bed despite knowing full well he had to be at work in just over an hour. Fog hazed over his mind and he rolled onto his stomach, the silk bedding caressing his scarred stomach and arms. A soft shine of sunlight hit his eyes through the curtain and he frowned at the uselessness of the item, seemingly unable to do its one and only job. There was a feeling, a sinister buzzing in his head that he just couldn't shake. All events from the previous night were cloudy and the last thing Izuku could really recall was his mom's welcoming voice through his phone. To call it unsettling would be an understatement. The obscurity of his memories was reflected through the pounding headache that abused his temples. Sitting up in bed, he reached for the drink on his bedside table, only to knock it over with his shaky hands and stare, hollow-eyed, as it spilt all over the wooden floor. With his will coming to an end, he collapsed back down onto his pillow and shoved his face desperately into the fabric. He hated this. He hated the numbing feeling of ambiguity and the void in his memories of the night before. Had he hit his head? It didn't make sense. A looming aura of dread surrounded his body and he realized that he couldn't just lay there for the rest of his life. Yesterday wasn't his best performance in class as it was and the kids were coming up to their first major fall exams. There was no time to mess around. Every minute was crucial to teach them all he knew and more. He couldn't be late. A ding resounded through the room and Izuku winced, the noise shooting right through his head. He reached for his phone, making sure he didn't knock it off the table, and blinked at the bright screen. Nothing, he asked incredulously. The lady, Susan, shook her head. Susan was one of the higher-up office assistants at the Dynamite Agency. One of the only workers who could handle Katsuki's attitude thoroughly. The rest all obeyed his every command, but Susan had thick skin and an equally persistent gaze. Dynamite valued those who could hold their own, hence the higher-ups being meticulously picked by the man himself. Not even a fiber of clothing, she said. The two stared at the dagger on the table, dumbfounded. Katsuki wasn't an idiot. When Amora disappeared the night before, paper and dagger in his place, he didn't even touch the remnants of the Vigilante. Instead, the Pro called for his agency to send somebody to collect the evidence and avoid contamination. How the poor evening worker got onto the roof was a mystery to him, but he was really hoping that the efforts put in would make a difference. Naturally, they didn't. Amora clearly wasn't an idiot either. There was absolutely nothing that could have linked him to any piece of evidence and Katsuki would have blown up at such news if he wasn't talking to Susan. Damn Susan. He crossed his arms. And the paper. They've been working on it all night, she shrugged. It can't be traced. The ink isn't anything special either, just basic bureau. Katsuki growled. What the hell am I paying these losers for? If you really meant that, you would have fired them 3 years ago. Frankly, he was stumped. It was obvious to anybody that Amora had given him the number for the sake of contact, a game, or control, he wasn't completely certain. But by straight up texting him, was he just playing into Amora's hands? What if it didn't even go straight to the Vigilante? A frown encased his features at his next thought. He liked working alone. Hell, he loved working alone. But Amora was hiding some secret intelligence within his actions, and Katsuki would be lying if he said he could catch the guy by himself. He couldn't even sneak up on him without being discovered. His philosophy of avoiding annoying people seemed to grow more idealistic by the day, with reality stepping all over his plans and dreams. But still, he didn't even scowl when his private floor filled with 3 more heartbeats. He'd grown to like these idiots quite a lot, and the first people you thought of were us. Denki gasped, hand on his heart as he threw himself down onto Katsuki's sofa. My preference was Deku, he corrected. But the loser seemed kind of preoccupied as it was. Mina's face lit up at the mention. Midori, how is he? She asked. I haven't had a chance to catch up with him in so long. Fine, Katsuki said, cold and brief. He felt almost as though he was convincing himself that. So this number is a dead end, Kirishima hummed. He sat down next to Denki. In front of him, his host stood with his arms crossed as Pinky perched herself on the end of the table. All we can do is text it, right? No shit, said Katsuki. Let's call it, Denki yelled. That's a horrible idea. Why, I say it's worth a shot, Mina shrugged. You'll all want to choke on air and die when you hear his voice, Katsuki growled. But fine. Denki didn't even hesitate before typing in the digits. The door to their right opened and Zero strolled in, coming from the bathroom. He raised his eyebrows at the universal intrigue as everyone watched Denki call the number. You're calling it, he cried. Harsh. Shish. S were sent his way as the phone rang. And rang. And rang. And clicked. The room was deathly silent as not a single word came from the other line. Katsuki seemed to be on the verge of exploding whereas Mina swung her legs with excitement. But still, there was silence. Kirishima bit his lip, squinting his eyes at the screen as if he could see through it to the other side. He almost considered talking, asking if Denki typed the wrong number. But then there was another click. And it wasn't a click signaling the end of a call, but instead a repeated click. Clicks with changing tones, growing faster, and faster, filled with animosity and threat. Footsteps, Denki mouthed, and everyone but Katsuki nodded. His eyes were glued to the phone, fists shaking. Was this a taunt? The footsteps sounded as if they were walking down a hall or a cobbled street, the only sound in the vicinity and therefore echoing with each tap. They increased in speed and volume by the second before breaking into a full-out run. Amora, presumably, was sprinting on the phone. They could all hear the rush of air hitting the other line, a sound so sharp and unnerving that it sent a chill through the room. For a split second, every person there entertained the irrational yet terrifying thought that Amora might actually leap through the phone screen and attack them on the spot. The sensation of dread was palpable, sending shivers down their spines and making their hands tremble with the overwhelming urge to press the end call button. Everyone, that is, except Katsuki. While the others recoiled in fear, a different kind of tension gripped him, an almost primal instinct, a forceful urge that defied reason. The buzzing energy around him only fueled his resolve, pushing him toward the one action everyone else feared. With a firm, unwavering hand, Katsuki reached for the phone, his fingers brushing against the screen as if daring Amora to make a move. And then, without a second thought, he picked up the item. Katsuki screamed into the device. Stop being such a freak and use your damn words. The group winced at the sudden volume change but nobody was intent on stopping it. Hello, he continued. Are you deaf? The footsteps stopped. A deep, solemn, emotionless voice filled their ears. Don't make me work overtime. And then the call ended. All 5 heroes in the room froze, mouths agape, and Zero had to hold Katsuki still to stop the man from throwing and smashing his phone all over the ground. That cunt. Katsuki's voice echoed through the room, his frustration palpable. Guess he had to get his steps in, Denki remarked with a casual shrug. Kirishima shot him a warning glare, though it was softened by a smirk. Fortunately, Katsuki seemed oblivious to the hint. What does that even mean? Mina asked, her brow furrowed in concern. Working overtime. Who the hell knows? Katsuki threw his hands up in exasperation, like a child frustrated with a puzzle. Bakubro, Hiroshima interjected calmly, you're playing right into his hands. You need to relax, man. I will throw you out that window. We can't let the Baku squad versus Amora team fall apart already. Hiroshima persisted, trying to lighten the mood. We seriously need to work on that name, Shiro chimed. Denki hummed thoughtfully. What hours does Amora even operate, anyway? Katsuki shrugged, having no idea. You don't know. Damn, Kachan, Denki teased. Stop calling me that. Look, Hiroshima raised his hands, trying to bring some order to the chaos. Let's all be serious for a second. Not knowing his patrol hours is a problem. We need to figure that out before we start running around like headless chickens. And how exactly, Mina asked with a raised eyebrow, are we supposed to figure that out? It's simple, Hiroshima said with a nonchalant shrug. We call him all day. If Katsuki could have facepalmed the entire room at once, he would have. The day came in flashes. Izuku blamed it on his headache. It had soothed from the morning but was still very prominent in his mind. Despite the pain, he refused to let it be a bollard in his daily drive, acting as normal and casual as ever when he taught. The last thing he wanted to do was worry his students, and UA students worried like hell. However, the speed of the day was quite unnerving. Every once in a while, it was as though his mind shut off, as if he did something that he had no recollection of doing whatsoever. It would be like he blinked, and then completely forgot every action he made in the past 5 minutes. On his break, he considered visiting Recovery Girl regarding the issue, maybe getting some aspirin, but UA's medbay made him feel faint whenever he visited. The memories were far from fond. The entire day, he found himself holding out for the sake of going out later that night. Patrol wasn't even an option. No matter how much he wanted to fight, his energy levels mixed with his evening plans didn't mix. If he went out as Amora, he'd only fit a few hours in before meeting up with his friends. Even then, his battery levels would be at a minimum, and he'd be basically miserable the entire event. But he was okay with that. In fact, he was more than okay, he was thrilled. The anticipation of hanging out filled him with a sense of excitement he hadn't felt in a long time. He couldn't wait to meet up with his friends, to laugh and joke around like they used to. It had been far too long since they'd all been together, and the thought of catching up with everyone, hearing their voices and seeing their smiles, brought warmth to his heart. God, how he had missed them. The memories of their last gathering flooded his mind, and he realized just how much he had taken those moments for granted. Now, the prospect of reuniting felt like a breath of fresh air, a reminder of the simple joys he had been longing for. Notification. Walking down Ripe Street, Izuku pulled out his phone, checking the message that just signaled its arrival. From Eijiro. Sorry man, something has come up so have to call this off. Texted the rest of the gang already. Another time, yeah, smiley face. Scene 1923. At 7:23 p.m., Izuku found himself standing outside Theorem's bar, his face pale as death itself. At 7:24 p.m., Izuku pushed open the doors of the bar and walked hollowly towards a stool. At 7:25 p.m., Izuku ordered himself 3 shots of vodka and a double gin and aid. In a far booth in the corner, a pair of heterochromatic eyes studied the teacher, watching as the melancholy man changed into somebody he didn't know. Shoto Todoroki had seen the cancellation message a long time ago, but the moment Midoriya walked into the bar, he couldn't bring himself to leave. He couldn't even bring himself to approach his old friend. Instead, he stared, unable to take his vision off the crumbling man, watching his eyes gloss over with each shot he took. What the hell is going on here? Chapter text. You've had enough, came a foreign voice, his right ear once again being invaded by an attacker. The voice wasn't foreign, Izuku was aware of that. In fact, it was one of the most recognizable voices in his memory. He heard the voice pretty often, on TV and the radio. In his memories, in his past, but he hadn't heard it in a while, over a year at least. So he just then decided it was foreign. A new voice. Unable to bring himself to look up, his forehead felt glued to his arms as he rested his head on the bar. There were many voices surrounding him, too many voices, and yet the one next to him was prominent and stern. He felt like a kid being reprimanded, muttering a soft, "Go away," to ward off the unwelcome presence. A Sahara-like atmosphere filled his throat and he went to reach for his drink, just to wave his hand into the open air. Somebody had taken it away. In hindsight, that was probably a good thing. Izuku had tripled his initial order in the time he'd been sitting at the stool and the barman didn't even hesitate, simply sending him a knowing, sympathetic look as he placed the glass down on the table. There was no doubt that everybody in the bar knew who Izuku was. Deku was extremely well known, and his fight was broadcast to the entire world. They'd seen him bleed out, lose his arms, almost die. There was no way they would ever get his face out of their memories. Even kids who weren't born at the time knew Deku's face. He often had people pat his back as he walked down the street or asked for some kind of keepsake autograph. People treated him how he used to treat All Might, like the world's greatest hero. "Thank you so much," Izuku cried, bowing repeatedly. "This will be an heirloom, a family treasure passed down for generations to come." And so, when it was evident that Izuku was drinking his sorrows away, his hollow eyes and pale face mixed with the excessive amount of alcohol being a giveaway, nobody stopped him. Nobody could even consider stopping him. Izuku was young. He had seen and done things that everyone in the bar couldn't even fathom. So if he deserved one thing, it was to mourn his losses and deal with his pain in his own way. Therefore, everybody left him alone. Everybody but one. Instead of the drink he wanted, an ice-cold glass was placed into his hand. At the sudden sensation, Izuku sat up, his vision blurred and lips parted with confusion. The glass felt like the coldest thing he'd ever touched and his fingers numbed painfully at the feel. "Wah! Drink it." Izuku squinted at the glass as if the object itself was talking to him. "No," he slurred. An unnaturally cool hand wrapped around his own and forced him to hold onto the glass. Izuku, sensing no malice and lacking the energy to whine, allowed the hand to force his arm up so the drink reached his mouth. He hesitated before taking a sip and quickly released all pressure on the glass. If it wasn't for the quick reflexes of the person next to him, it would have dramatically split all over his lap. "Can you walk?" The voice came again, persistent. "Can you shut up?" he retorted, going to rest his head back on his arms before a hand grabbed his clothes, pulling him back up. He wasn't wearing anything special, just jeans, a white t-shirt, and a black jacket that used to be All Might's, but he still felt mildly offended at the rough handling of his clothes. Stop. Had he been sober, he would have felt horrible about talking to someone like that. But he wasn't and therefore he didn't. A sigh sounded, followed by a long pause. "Midoriya," said the man. "Midoriya, look at me." Izuku turned his head away like a child, mentally construing a, "if I can't see him, he can't see me," theory. Head aching, he closed his eyes momentarily in thought, except nothing rational came to mind. Since he turned 20 over a year ago, Izuku had legally been able to drink as much as he wanted. However, he chose not to. On occasion, he would have a cocktail, nothing too alcoholic or with a high percentage, but enough to make him simply merry. But again, that was simply on occasion. Others would be around doing the same thing if not more, and so he would drink for the sake of fitting in over anything else. He didn't enjoy it, though. This was the first time in his entire life that he'd drunk this much, let alone drink on his own. Hell, he didn't even want to imagine how much money he must have spent. As he sat turned away from the nagging voice, that same chilled hand grabbed his chin and squished his cheeks. He could tell they were trying to be gentle, but Izuku's tenacity made that rather difficult and he found the man having quite a dominant grip on his face, strong enough to turn his head with ease and force Izuku to stare directly into his multicolored eyes. His breath caught his throat at the sight, face heating up with horror and embarrassment. Suddenly, Izuku became very aware of his surroundings. "Don't Look Back in Anger" by Oasis was blasting through the bar and he ran a shaky hand through his hair, almost losing balance on the stool at the same time. Shoto glared at him with an empty face, yet extremely concerned pupils. Immediately, Izuku found himself lost in his eyes. Dressed in a black button-down, the top two buttons undone for comfort, he looked casual yet professional, a look that only a Todoroki was able to achieve. With wide eyes, Izuku studied his face. It was Shoto. Shoto, one of the only few people who constantly had his back, who prioritized his well-being over his power, who cared. He didn't know what demon possessed him when he lunged forward and embraced the hero in a tight hug, but the warm and recognizable presence of Shoto was something that he hadn't felt in a long time. The pro, rather stunned from the sudden contact, lightly returned the hug. He slightly activated his right side, allowing a chill to embrace the sweating Midoriya and possibly shake him out of this drunken state. This, to his demise, only made Midoriya cling to him more. Shoto, he mumbled into his shoulder. I can't. Shoto frowned, moving his right hand onto Midoriya's forehead. Again, this didn't help his cause. Shoto hoped for Midoriya to come to his senses, but instead, a pain sob sounded from below, causing him to freeze up. I can do his anymore, sobbed Midoriya. What? Shoto whispered. I don't. Midoriya, fell like me, what can't you do anymore? At that moment, Shoto was so glad that he had willingly paid for Midoriya's bill before he even began talking to him. He could sense the howl that the man was about to release from a mile away, and forcefully dragged him off the stool and out of the bar with an unnatural level of speed. Again, that was the correct move. The second they stepped onto the pavement, Midoriya collapsed back into Shoto's chest and began heaving, sobbing, and screaming into his shirt. Shoto had seen Midoriya sad. He'd seen him distraught, but he'd never seen him crumble like this. The emotions released from his body came with such a built-up pressure that he'd never even heard from grieving parents. Midoriya was sobbing as if he'd been to hell and back, as if he only communicated in tears and pain, as if affliction was all he knew. But was any of that wrong? Shoto often had nightmares about the past. Jesus, he even had nightmares about the present. But did his level of suffering even attempt to level that of Midoriya's? To him, hero work helped. The strain of his past proved worthwhile when he reflected on his current state. Admiration was one thing, but being a real pro so high on the ranks was more than an accomplishment. It was a comfort. He knew his struggles weren't for nothing when he walked into his agency and greeted his staff and went on his hero patrols. And even if his past was unstable, his future was bright and clear. Every day, he added a new brick to the bridge of progression. Every day, he helped somebody new, which erased regrets and loss that was engraved into his mind. Every day, Midoriya woke up and went to work as a teacher. He faced those same memories. Those same classrooms and same grounds of which he watched himself and others be torn to shreds. A murky future. A sad, plain future that was far from his dreams. Shoto could not blame Midoriya for getting smashed to cope with his pain, because what else did he have to take his mind off it? He knew that Class A barely saw him. They, including him, were all too busy, and most of their agencies and homes were based in Tokyo. Shoto knew Midoriya's mom lived locally, and he had All Might and the UA staff, but how much could he resonate with them? How much could he relate to pros who were older and couldn't fully understand the amount of pressure that they all put on him? Sure, Midoriya was destined to fight all for one from the beginning, but God, it was messed up. All of it was messed up. They were all too young and too immature, and Shoto swore he would lay down his life before allowing anything like that to ever happen again. When he got the message from Kirishima, he hoped the gathering would help them all. Remind the entire group that they had each other to lean on, if not only for the sake of reminding himself that. He hadn't even arrived when he got the cancellation text, but he still decided to get a drink considering he made the effort to get ready and travel down. But imagine if he didn't. If he decided to go home and missed Midoriya. Would he have drunk himself numb? How far do you live? Shoto asked between cries. In response, Midoriya let out something incomprehensible, a clear failed attempt to answer. I'll take you back to mine if I have to. And no, he yelped. Then tell me where you live. Appent say, cert. Shoto parted his lips, even he couldn't decode that one. I don't talk drunk, he said. Say it slowly. Midoriya pulled away from Shoto and shook his head, trying to steady himself. Apart. An apartment where? What tower? A pregnant pause. For some bizarre reason, a wave of distress seemed to swarm over Midoriya. Shoto furrowed his eyebrows, trying to piece apart what was happening to the guy, and that's when it stopped. The rest followed in stages. The sobbing came to a halt. Midoriya's face flattened completely, going deadpan. And then, to Shoto's horror, Midoriya's once immobile hand moved towards his freckled face and violently slapped it. Midoriya slapped himself. Had it been anyone else, they would have stumbled from the impact, maybe even fallen over. But Midoriya stayed perfectly grounded. His cheek turned red from the impact, but the green-haired guy didn't even flinch. Shoto's eyes widened in unbridled shock, completely taken aback by the sudden action. "What the hell?" he yelled. "Don't do that. Why did you just do that?" Staring at Midoriya, Shoto found himself looking at a completely different person. He looked content, mildly angry, but not sobbing his eyes out. In fact, there wasn't a single remnant of tears on his face. His once puffed, red eyes were emotionless and plain, and his lip didn't quiver in the slightest. Not even the breeze triggered an action. "Idiot," Midoriya muttered to himself bitterly. He clearly meant for Shoto not to hear it, but he did. "Midoriya," Shoto realized he was acting much more hesitant than he should be. Almost as if he wasn't talking to Midoriya. Idiot," he repeated quietly, more angry this time. "Are you okay?" Midoriya, with recognition, met Shoto's eyes with a warm smile. "I'm fine, thank you, Todoroki." Shoto tensed. "I'm sorry for your troubles," he bowed, turning on his feet and strolling down the sidewalk like nothing had ever happened in the first place. There, outside Theorem's bar, Shoto found himself absolutely stooped. He walked away. He just walked away. He just sobbed in my arms and walked away. Eyes glued to the figure traversing down the street, Shoto couldn't even move to follow him. There was an aura, an unwelcoming presence that forced him to freeze. Midoriya didn't want to be followed. It was like a lever had switched in his brain, and Shoto struggled to believe that the person leaving his sight was the same man who had almost drunk himself to death 10 minutes prior. The same man, I don't, Midoriya, fell like me, the same man, Katsuki's eyes widened in disbelief as he read the text, his mouth falling open in surprise. He stared at the message for a moment, letting it sink in before a slow, amused smirk tugged at the corners of his lips. He shook his head, his mind racing with thoughts of Deku stumbling around in a drunken haze. The image was too ridiculous not to laugh at. A strong, breathy chuckle escaped him, filling the room with its unexpected sound. He leaned back onto his bed, his expression softening as he continued to smirk, unable to contain his amusement at the thought of the situation. This was too good to let go. Katsuki stared at the message, biting his lip as a knot of unease formed in his chest. Part of him felt bad for his previous reaction. Deku was crying. That didn't sit right with him. He couldn't pinpoint the source of his concern, but it gnawed at him all the same. Deku had gotten over his teenage waterworks by the end of their 3rd year. Now, he never really cried unless something was seriously wrong. His mind spun with questions, each more unsettling than the last. Was Icy Hot messing with him? Did something happen at UA? Had Auntie Inko gotten hurt? The possibilities made his stomach churn, and he found himself clenching his jaw in frustration, trying to push down the rising tide of worry. He shook his head, determined to get to the bottom of this. But just as he was about to demand more information, his phone buzzed violently in his hand, the screen lighting up with an incoming call. His eyes flicked to the name, and his annoyance flared when he saw it was Susan. Damn Susan. Why the hell was she calling at this hour? It was nearly midnight, and Susan knew better than to bother him unless it was urgent. His concern for Deku was momentarily eclipsed by irritation as he stared at the phone, willing it to stop ringing. With a low growl, he pressed the answer button, his mood souring further. Susan didn't just call for no reason, and the late hour only added to his sense of foreboding. Whatever was happening, it wasn't good. He let out a huff, frustration simmering just below the surface as he pushed aside his conversation with Icy Hot. As much as he wanted to get to the bottom of Deku's situation, something in Susan's unexpected call told him this was something he couldn't ignore. His grip on the phone tightened as her panicked voice sounded through his speaker. Code Orange, she breathed, rushed and tensed. Off. I'm not kidding, Katsuki. It could turn black. At the first name address, all of Katsuki's doubts dissolved. He immediately shot up from bed, not even bothering to put an end to the call, and raced out of his apartment. Typical, he thought, cursing himself, typical. At the Dynamite Agency, there were 3 codes known by himself, higher-up staff, and the majority of his interns. Code Green. Mild accident in the building. This was more common than he chose to admit. Dynamite liked to take in people with powerful quirks. Powerful quirks meant easy destruction if they got out of control. So Code Greens were a weekly, if not a bi-daily thing. On one of Kirishima's visits, he put up a _days without a Code Green sign. Katsuki could assure you that the count had never reached double digits. Then there was Code Orange, intruder. This one usually meant trouble. The Dynamite building was huge, one of the biggest agencies in Japan, and therefore there were hundreds of workers and too many floors to even count. The bottom floors didn't have much, just a grand entrance area and check-in desks, etc. To even ascend the building, you had to scan yourself in and walk through a discrete X-ray machine. If the machine detected you having something to cause intentional harm, support gear exempt, it would block you from entering. Interning heroes and most staff had their faces scanned so they could avoid security easily. But strangers couldn't get into the main building if their lives depended on it. The majority of agencies had these same security systems, but Katsuki made sure his was the best. Code Orange had rung a few times, but it was usually sorted by the heroes in the building before Dynamite even heard about it. If Susan was calling him at this hour, it meant that the heroes either couldn't handle it or weren't available. Plus, she said it may turn into Code Black. That was an issue, a big issue. Code Black meant that the entire building was under attack, which immediately put hundreds of lives in danger. If the building came down, everyone inside would be trapped, along with the surrounding buildings and civilians. Code Black was bad. But it hadn't reached that yet. Katsuki was in Musudafu. His agency was in Tokyo. He could fly there with his explosions, he'd done that before, but the energy that took was overpowering if he were to face a big villain once he arrived. After skipping all the stairs, he ran out of the apartment block, standing on the sidewalk momentarily and looking around with haste. There was an excessive amount of people out for a Tuesday night, and some of them pointed in awe at the pro, oblivious of his distress. Subconsciously, his hands balled into fists. How am I gonna get to Tokyo? My car is locked in the underground garage. How the am I gonna get to shitty Tokyo? Get in. Shut up, he yelled, running a hand over his face. I'm thinking. Bakugo, the voice persisted. Get in the car. Wait. Slowly, Katsuki turned his head to face the road. A lot of people on the sidewalk had paused their stroll to stare at the scene unfolding, enthralled by the rare, yet longed interaction of heroes. That's when he saw him. Probably the last person he wanted to see at that moment, sitting casually with his window rolled down and head tilted like he was some kind of model. Walking into rooms posing for pictures, he recalled Mineta saying in their first year. Goddamn, he hated that short bastard. Now he had the image of that purple pervert in his head and the display of Shoto Todoroki directly in front of him. In the flesh. Hell no. Right off, he hissed. Shoto raised his eyebrows at him and reached over to open the passenger door. For a moment, Katsuki didn't move. Was this really his only option? Hitching a ride with goddamn icy hot. To his left, a few people started to approach him for presumably what was a photo, and Katsuki found himself cornered. Rounding the car, he approached the passenger side and reluctantly slid into the cushioned seat. He had to admit that Todoroki had a nice-ass car. My agency, he demanded, as if he were talking to a taxi driver and not a friend. Katsuki didn't dislike Shoto, but seeing his face ignited competition. Lacking his old thrill from trying to beat Deku, Shoto was the next best thing, his statistics constantly threatening to beat him in the ranks. Like hell would he drop down to number 5. But still, he didn't feel completely comfortable sitting in the car. Whether it was an inferiority complex issue or not, he didn't know. But something about Shoto pissed him off. Deku was always good competition. He got his heart beating, making his chest tighten at the sight of him purely because he understood the concept of their challenge. Deku used to fight back, whereas Todoroki just shrugged and ignored the battle. Katsuki felt as if it was one-sided and he hated that. One-sided rivalries got on his nerves. But, at the end of the day, Todoroki wasn't Deku. Why the rush? Shoto asked, one hand on the wheel. Katsuki wondered why he was dressed like he'd just come back from a date, but he didn't look particularly great himself. An entire day of ringing the same number over and over, just for nobody to answer, was tiring. He wasn't doing that boring-ass task in his hero costume, so he'd put on black jeans and his own damn merch. Great Explosion Murder God Dynamite was printed across his chest on an oversized, gray t-shirt. The two residents of the car were clothed in vastly different aesthetics. Someone's broken in, he muttered, crossing his arms and sinking into the seat. Can't you go any faster? Broken in, Shoto hummed. Can't the interns sort it? Katsuki scoffed. Unlike your shitty agency, the Dynamite Agency doesn't torture their staff and gives them reasonable hours. You know that's not what I mean, he frowned. My hours are fine. You must have people on night shifts, right? Obviously. So why were you running around the street like a lost child? Off, Katsuki spat. I'll get out the damn car. Doesn't bother me. You goddamn. For a second, Katsuki held onto the door handle to step out of the car, only to stop when he realized they were speeding down a main road. When he asked for Shoto to go faster, he didn't expect the guy to actually do it, but they were overtaking almost every car they passed, pretty dangerously to say the least. Shitty hero you are. A pregnant pause. I was coming to see you, Shoto admitted. You what? When I texted you, I was pulled over at the side of the road. You stopped answering, so I figured I'd just talk to you in person. Creep. It's not creepy to care. The blonde paused, taken aback. About me. No, Shoto corrected. Midoriya. Oh, ha, I can't believe you didn't take a damn video. Katsuki watched as Shoto's deadpan faltered momentarily. The concern that he saw reminded him of his own from the day before, or 2 days before, considering the time had already passed midnight. That worry after seeing Deku, the guilt, and most importantly, the hope that others had noticed it, all of those feelings were manifesting themselves once again. And he couldn't handle it. After all these years, after the graduation ceremony and the teary goodbyes with promises of visits and hangouts, he couldn't handle it. After everything Deku had done, after everything that he had done to Deku, he just could not handle it. He couldn't bear seeing Deku upset. But he wouldn't admit that. Since the League's defeat, Katsuki found his emotions and opinions toward Deku shifting in ways he never expected. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed, but something inside him had been altered. Maybe it was guilt, a nagging sense of responsibility for everything they'd gone through. Or perhaps it was a grudging admiration, though he'd never admit it to anyone, least of all to himself. It could have been the image of Deku lying in that hospital bed, his head wrapped in bandages, yet still managing to flash that stupid, unwavering smile. That damn smile. There was something about it that stirred something deep within Katsuki, a warmth he'd spent years trying to snuff out, to freeze, ever since they were kids. But now, he couldn't deny it any longer. That warmth had become something more, something he couldn't ignore. It was a lifeline, a force that kept pulling him back whenever he started to drift too far into the darkness that often threatened to consume him. Class A had almost lost that warmth. Too many times, in fact. Katsuki could still feel the weight of those moments, the times when Deku had been pushed to the brink, and how close they'd come to losing him. And in those moments, Katsuki realized something profound. He couldn't let that warmth slip away, not ever again. It wasn't just about protecting Deku, it was about protecting the part of himself that had begun to rely on that warmth, that light, to keep going. But guilt overpowered that. Embarrassment and resentment took the place of most of his emotions, and although every interaction he had with Deku since he was 17 was friendlier and more comfortable, he was still snarky and treated him like a Deku. He was softer and gentler but still acted like Katsuki Bakugo because that was simply who he was. Katsuki Bakugo couldn't just be erased. However, Katsuki Bakugo would have rather died than admit how often his thoughts drifted to Deku. Not in any freaky or weird way. Hell no, but after being by someone's side for so long, suddenly having that connection severed was more jarring than he'd ever anticipated. His past was a sustained presence in his mind, and, like it or not, Deku was always at the center of it. No matter how much he tried to push it away, the green-haired nerd was the main character in every significant memory, and Katsuki couldn't control that. It wasn't about missing him. Katsuki would never go that far. It was more like a habit he couldn't shake, a shadow that refused to fade. And as much as he hated to admit it, those memories shaped more of who he was than he cared to acknowledge. Deku was a constant. He used to always be there. Always accept Katsuki's angry rants and fuel his already inflated ego. And then he disappeared. He went to work whilst Katsuki fulfilled their childhood dreams. And Katsuki had no idea how to call that constant back to his side. Without sounding weird, of course. I didn't even know he was a drinker, Shoto added quietly, snapped the passenger back to reality. He isn't. It was a mess, Bakugo, he mumbled. I had to drag him out. Katsuki bit his lip. Shoto continued. He didn't even talk to me, he just kept saying that he couldn't do something. Did you take him home? No. Katsuki sat up, alert. The hell, is he still there? He walked off, Shoto shrugged. The idiot probably fell over and died. The blonde threw his hands up in exasperation. No, it was weird. Shoto made a sharp turn and Katsuki jolted in his seat. Learn to drive, goddamn it. He gripped the door. Shoto ignored him. He just walked off like nothing happened. Katsuki raised his eyebrows. The driver sighed. That was after he slapped himself, he said casually, like it was no big deal. Okay. A laugh escaped him as he studied the man's words. Glamouroki, are you drunk? Would I be driving if I was drunk? Your lack of skills makes me think so. Katsuki, who hadn't done up his seatbelt once during the ride, shot forward in his seat as Shoto roughly braked. If it weren't for him putting his hands on the dashboard, he would have slammed into it and no doubt set off the airbag. He muttered multiple curses and insults towards the driver before looking forward. We're here, Shoto hummed simply. Finally, he hadn't even noticed the arrival until it was pointed out. To be honest, part of Katsuki believed Todoroki had stopped for the sole purpose of kicking him out of the damn car. Opening the door, he wasted no time stepping out of the vehicle. Eyeing the tall tower, he couldn't see anything particularly wrong. Code Black was a no-show. However, as Shoto also got out of the car and stood next to him, he noticed the abundance of other people on the street staring up. Directly up, almost as if they were stargazing. He tried to follow their line of sight but failed to see what it was they were staring at. The sky, the moon. Why the hell are there so many people out past midnight? And why the hell do they all look so happy? Standing in front of the entrance, he watched as Susan exited the building and swiftly approached him, a solemn, stern look on her face. She no doubt was alerted about his arrival and had been waiting keenly to break the news. Damn Susan. You're going to hate this, she said calmly. Shoto looked curiously between the two people, unaware of her role in the agency or who she even was. Spit it out, lady, Katsuki growled. Tensing his hands, he allowed a few warm-up sparks to escape from his palms. At the sound of his voice, some of the street's attention moved from the sky down to the two pros. Damn, why is everyone always looking at us? He'd be lying if he said he didn't like it. Where's the action? Top floor. Oh, so, that's how it is. Attack my building. Attack me for all I care. But do not attack my personal floor and think you can get away with it. Katsuki looked to the ground, silent. Shoto, concerned, whispered something in his ear, but by the time the sound was about to reach him, the blonde was already in the air, shooting explosions to propel him up the tower. His feet collided with the glass exterior, allowing him to run up the side of the building with as much speed as he could conjure. If all eyes weren't on him before, they sure as hell were now. With all his might, he ran to the top floor, and it wasn't until he did so that he realized how tall his agency's tower truly was. Once he reached it, he primarily saw that every single one of the floor-to-ceiling windows was smashed. The gym equipment, the inexpensive gym equipment, was littered all over the floor, most of it broken or in pieces. From what Katsuki could see, it was as if somebody had picked up the heavy-ass items and lobbed them as far as they could. And they'd smashed his TV. Hands feeling as if they were about to explode, he clenched his fists and yelled profanities into the vast, broken area. It looked like a war scene, as if a major battle had taken place in his hangout area. The vandalization of the floor pissed him off more than if they knocked down the entire damn building. It was impersonal. Whoever this was really had it out for him. "Your TV won't work," a voice whined from the corner of the room. "I'm trying to watch One Piece." Slowly and deliberately, Katsuki turned his entire body to face the sound. There, sitting on the sofa that Kaminari and Kirishima were lounging on all day, was Amora. Amora. The had his legs propped up on the table, one arm on top of the sofa with the other outstretched ahead of him, fueling his futile attempt at pressing buttons on the broken TV remote. The TV wasn't even facing him. It was on the floor. Without a second thought, he charged towards the vigilante. The masked man turned his head from the imaginary TV and glared at the approaching hero, utterly unfazed. "Why don't I smash your head into it and see if that works?" yelled Katsuki, firing his explosions. The sofa was already in tatters. If destroying it even more meant taking down Amora, he was prepared to make that sacrifice. The low ceiling and smoke created a temporary screen over his vision, mixing together to blind him for a few valuable seconds. In that darkness, three things happened. 1. His phone rang. An undying jingle spread through the settling room as the item vibrated in his pocket. His hands were too warm to hold his phone, so he couldn't decline the call. It just kept ringing, and ringing, and ringing. 2. A cold breath ran down his neck, invading his body and attacking his spine all at once. Katsuki froze. And 3. A chilled object met with his throat. Sharp, thin, and freezing. There was enough pressure to make itself known, but not nearly enough to cut him. "Can we talk now?" The voice shot straight through him like a bullet. He couldn't put a face to it. It was deep and unnatural. Cold, lifeless, holding only hints of sarcasm and humor at certain times, like during the TV comment. But just then, there was no emotion. Only emptiness. However, the voice did have a certain tang to it, or maybe his blood was rushing too much. "I'll take that as a yes." Amora was speaking so close to his ear that, had the man not been wearing a mask, he no doubt would have felt lips on his skin. "What do you want?" Katsuki hissed. As much as he didn't want to listen, he had no choice. Amora wasn't going to kill him, but the dagger at his throat still posed a threat. "Do you hear that?" Amora asked, innocently. Katsuki grunted and, to his horror, Amora started humming along to the sound ringing from his phone. "How could I not? Hell, that's me calling," he chimed, interrupting. "Notice how I'm doing that. Notice how I am calling you. What about it? I want you to get through your little thin skull." Amora lifted his free hand to knock at Katsuki's temple. The pro felt like he was about to blow up. "That I didn't give you this number to around. Why? Let me talk." The dagger pressed harder against his skin. Katsuki unwillingly silenced himself. "You think you're in control here. That you have the high ground," scoffed Amora. "But I gave you this number so I didn't have to do shit like this. So I can talk to you when I want to talk to you," he hissed. "Class this as your first warning, because I originally planned to do it through text. One-on-one. But now I see that you've gotten friends involved. They're not involved. Zip it." He jolted the dagger. "I don't give a about your friends, but trust that I will deal with them if I have to. This is the first time that I've physically gotten in your way. I want you to understand that if you even step in front of me, I will react tenfold each and every time. You tried shooting me off a roof, so I destroyed your crappy man cave. Drop this case now and nobody will get hurt. You clearly don't know me well, huh?" Katsuki smirked. "Oh, number 4, Amora cooed. "I know you. I know that you're waiting for Shoto Todoroki to sneak up behind me so you can slip away." Katsuki tensed. "I know that you're only after me to fuel your mind and erase that delicate inferiority complex that haunts you. And I know that you think I look down on you. That I think I'm better than you. Who are you? But do you wanna know something, Dynamite?" he teased. "I do look down on you, because I am better than you. You, in every way, shape, and form. Shut the up." He gritted his teeth. And I will kill you if you try to take this away from me. Shut up. Katsuki didn't see it coming. Hell, he didn't even hear it coming. A dark haze engulfed his vision as he was knocked back, falling to the ground. It wasn't until the pain hit that he realized something hard had whacked him from behind, enough to numb his senses completely. He reached for the back of his head, blood, and noticed his eyelids struggling to stay open. Trying to sit up, his arms gave out completely and his head collided with the ground once more. How hard was I hit? The voice was leaving, or maybe Katsuki was leaving, but he still managed to hear Amora's final words, whether they were intended for his ears or not. Bakug, Dyna, sir, Kanwai, and I will kill you if you try to take this away from me. Chapter text. Izuku woke up oddly, refreshed. Once again, that familiar, disorienting haze settled over his mind as he slowly sat up in bed. The room was dim, the early morning light barely filtering through the curtains. He stretched his arms upwards, his body moving instinctively like a child waking from a long nap, the gesture almost too innocent for someone who had seen and endured so much. With a soft groan, he swung his legs over the edge of the bed, the cool floor meeting his bare feet as he prepared to stand. Cautiously, he took his first step, bracing himself for the inevitable aftermath of last night's indulgence. He expected the familiar signs of exhaustion, the dizziness, the weakness, the queasiness that often accompanied a night of heavy drinking. But to his surprise, his body responded with an unsettling normalcy. There was no vertigo, no shaky limbs. In fact, he felt perfectly fine, almost unnervingly so. It was as if his body had somehow bypassed the consequences of his actions, leaving him with a sense of clarity that felt out of place. Despite the lingering fog that clouded his thoughts, Izuku was painfully aware of the amount of alcohol he had consumed the night before. He wasn't a heavy drinker by nature, far from it. His usual composure, his steadfast resolve, these were traits he prided himself on. But last night was different. Last night, desperation had overpowered discipline. Vulnerability had broken through the walls he had so carefully constructed over the years. It wasn't in his nature to crumble like that, to let himself spiral into the kind of despair that drove a person to seek solace at the bottom of a bottle. He had always been the strong one, the reliable one, the hero who stood firm even when everything else was falling apart. But everyone had their limits, and yesterday, Izuku had found his. It had been a particularly day, one of those days where everything seemed to go wrong, where the weight of the world felt unbearably heavy on his shoulders. All he had wanted was to escape, to silence the relentless thoughts that gnawed at his mind, to numb the pain that had taken root deep within his chest. He needed something, anything, to take the edge off before the darkness swallowed him whole. He had feared that if he didn't find some way to quiet the storm inside, he might do something reckless, something dangerous. The thought of finding himself standing in the middle of the street, vulnerable and lost, had terrified him more than anything else. And so, he had turned to the one thing he had always avoided, alcohol. It was a temporary fix, a way to drown out the noise, to blur the edges of his reality until it was bearable again. But now, standing in the quiet of his room, Izuku couldn't help but feel a deep sense of unease. The fact that he felt so normal, so unaffected, after what he had done, only served to heighten his anxiety. It was as if his body was betraying him, refusing to acknowledge the damage he had inflicted upon it. Shaking the grim thoughts from his head, he tried to piece together the events of the night. A friendly bartender, Shoto, tears. What had he said to Shoto? Had he caused him to worry? The entire premise of possibly putting a burden on his friend was dire. Izuku didn't feel hungover, but he sure felt ill at the thought of his sorrow spilling onto somebody else. Water under the bridge, he murmured to himself, the words slipping from his lips like a mantra as he walked towards his bathroom. His thoughts drifted hazily through the fog of last night's decisions. The tears. But then what happened? And how did he even get home? He couldn't remember every detail, that was to be expected. Alcohol had a way of blurring the lines, softening the sharp edges of reality until everything bled together. There was a vague sense of something, an action, a conversation, maybe, that he might regret if he examined it too closely. But for now, he chose not to. For now, he felt happy. It was a simple word, but in its simplicity lay a depth he hadn't experienced in some time. The oppressive weight that had been hanging over him for what felt like an eternity, like a storm cloud threatening to unleash its fury, was gone. It wasn't that his problems had vanished. They were still there, lurking somewhere in the background. But for once, they weren't pressing down on him, and he could breathe without that constant, suffocating pressure. Izuku wasn't naive. He knew this lightness might be temporary, that reality would come crashing back in eventually, perhaps harder than before. But in this fleeting moment of peace, he wasn't going to ruin it by dwelling on what couldn't be changed. Besides, he had more immediate concerns to focus on. He glanced at the clock, the numbers glaring back at him with the reminder that time was moving forward, and so should he. There was a class waiting for him, students who would be expecting their teacher to be as strong and composed as always. That role demanded his attention, his energy, and it was a responsibility he took seriously, no matter what had transpired the night before. And so, with a deep breath, Izuku began his repetitive, undying morning routine. The moment Izuku stepped into his classroom, he felt a heavy sense of foreboding crush him. It wasn't the atmosphere of the room. It wasn't even the silence of the room. But rather it was the wide, expecting eyes of Yuji, the same kid who asked him attentively about Denki, following him as he walked towards his desk. Without a doubt, Izuku had a good relationship with his students. Every class that he'd taught loved him intently, and it didn't take long for him to become the teacher that freshmen longed to see on their timetable. It wasn't just his popular past that helped, but the genuine casual aura of his classroom mixed with his students' excelling grades was something everybody wanted to experience. Although nobody had directly told him this yet, so he wouldn't find out until they did, Izuku was the best teacher in the entire staff team. He was friendly, attentive, and approachable, but if he needed to he could easily switch up to get his classroom under control. Still, this wasn't how his class usually acted. They were an energetic lot, greeting him every day with a smile and booming voices. Today, they were quiet, and Yuji looked as though he was about to explode from the words he was holding back. Izuku paused when he got to his desk, placing his bag down warily. "Good morning," he smiled. Silence. With a piercing glare, he returned the tense eye contact with Yuji. Before Izuku could even ask what was wrong, the boy shot up in his seat. The girl who was always with him, Nara, quickly stood up to push him back down, but he was persistent. "Is he okay?" the boy cried. Simultaneously, the class grimaced, as if all of them were dying to ask the exact same thing. "What?" asked Izuku. "Dynamite." He ran a hand through his hair. "The news have been covering it all morning and—" "Dynamite," Nara spoke up, concern laced in her voice. "Haven't you seen it, Mr. Deku?" All of Izuku's morning ecstasy faded at the seriousness of Nara's voice. Unlike Yuji, she wouldn't play around. He moved his gaze towards the girl, silently asking her to continue. However, Yuji's rushed words reached his ears first. "Amora got him, sensei." Katsuki couldn't remember how he got there, but it was raining. Small, sharp droplets kissed his cheeks as he looked around, vision slowly coming to with each harsh blink. Rubble. The landscape was a chaotic mess, a nightmarish wasteland where everything that once stood had been reduced to dust and debris. The acrid smell of smoke and scorched earth filled the air, mixing with the sharp tang of metal and something more bitter, something that stung at the back of his throat and made his eyes burn. Shattered concrete and twisted steel beams were scattered everywhere, strewn across what used to be solid ground, now a jagged, uneven terrain that seemed to stretch on endlessly in every direction. His ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else, but beneath it, he thought he could hear something, a faint, distant echo of screams and the ominous groaning of collapsing structures. The sky overhead was dark, choked with clouds of dust and smoke, blocking out the sun and casting everything in a sickly, grayish hue. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned around, searching for any sign of life, any sign of hope in the devastation. But what he saw made his blood run cold. His friends, Denki, Hiroshima, Mina, were lying on the ground, motionless. Their bodies were twisted at unnatural angles, limbs splayed out as if they had been tossed aside like rag dolls. Their eyes were open, staring blankly up at the sky, devoid of the spark that had once defined them. There was no doubt about it, they were dead. All of them. What the? He coughed, voice crisp. He stumbled forward, his breath hitching in his throat as he dropped to his knees beside them. His hands trembled as he reached out, as if touching them might somehow bring them back, as if this could be undone, as if it could all be a horrible mistake. But their skin was cold to the touch, and no amount of shaking or calling their names would change that. A heavy breath escaped him. They were gone. Why? Why was he the only one left? The crushing weight of guilt settled on him, heavy and suffocating. It was a recognizable guilt. Too recognizable. Your fault, whispered a voice, so soft it was almost lost in the chaos. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The words echoed in his mind, bouncing around his skull like a sinister mantra. He looked around wildly, but there was no one there, only the ruins of what had once been, and the lifeless bodies of those he had cared about. Your fault, the voice repeated, this time more insistent, more accusing. It was inside his head now, gnawing at his sanity, tearing apart the fragile threads that held him together. He wanted to scream, to deny it, to say it wasn't true, to say that Amora was all bark and no bite. But the words stuck in his chest, trapped by the overwhelming tide of horror that hit him. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything shifted. He shot up in bed, his body jerking upright as if pulled by an invisible force. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of his chest, and his breath came in ragged, uneven gasps. For a moment, he was disoriented, his mind still trapped in the nightmare, unable to distinguish between what was real and what wasn't. It took him a few seconds to realize that he was no longer surrounded by rubble and death, but instead, he was in an unfamiliar room. The bed beneath him was soft, the sheets crisp and clean. The air was cool and sterile, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the dream. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. White walls, a simple chair in the corner, a small table with a glass of water on it, nothing that gave him any clue as to where he was or how he had gotten there. A hospital, maybe. His head ached, a dull throb that pulsed in time with his racing heartbeat. He reached up, touching the back of his skull gingerly, and winced at the sharp pain that flared beneath his fingers. As the fog of sleep and confusion began to lift, he tried to piece together what had happened. The last thing he remembered was the TV. The TV. What about the TV? The TV. Your TV won't work, a voice whined from the corner of the room. I'm trying to watch One Piece. Oh, that Immediately, Katsuki found himself pushing the blanket off of his body. He was dressed in a plain white t-shirt and joggers, but still felt horribly exposed and vulnerable. He wasn't a kid anymore, he told himself. He shouldn't be waking up in hospital like this. His feet hit the cool ground, and the moment he stood up, the ringing in his ear resumed tenfold, screaming at him to sit back down. He tried his hardest to push that feeling to the back of his mind. Amora had put him in hospital. Katsuki was a young pro-hero and he was put in hospital by a goddamn vigilante. He growled, walking towards the window door and throwing it open. As soon as he did, he found himself staggering back. His body disobeyed his mind as the loud, bustling activity of the hospital hall shot straight through his skull. Walk, goddammit, he yelled at his legs. You dealt with an exploded heart, you can deal with his shit. Suddenly, all surrounding noise paused. The door clicked close. Katsuki's eyes widened once realized that he was no longer facing the door, instead being focused primarily on the bed. And somebody was behind him. Out of pure instinct, he spun around, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. His fist clenched tightly, and he threw a punch with all the force he could muster, aiming at whatever threat was behind him. But before the blow could land, a warm hand caught his scarred fist in midair, stopping it dead in its tracks. The grip was firm but gentle, not a move of aggression, but one of control. He froze in shock. Kachan, Izuku hissed, condemning him. He held Katsuki's fist in his hand like it was no big deal to catch, and slowly lowered both of their arms before releasing. You're supposed to be in bed. The blonde's mouth fell open. Deku, 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 he barked. What the air you doing here? Don't you have work? Izuku rolled his eyes, taking a sip of his hot chocolate. Good morning to you too, Kachan. Gumdrop, offered Izuku, tilting his head. Sitting uncomfortably in the waiting room, he rummaged his hands through his coat pockets, unnerved by the fact he didn't even have any gumdrops to give had the man accepted one. To his relief, he shook his head. No thanks, said Tsukauchi. I had braces as a kid, so I'm put off by candy. Flabbergasted, Izuku slowly nodded. What kind of insane person hated sweets? Sure, Izuku himself was more of a savory guy, but had there been a bowl of candy in front of him, he wouldn't have been able to resist snatching one. Some could say he had a sweet tooth. They sat in the hospital waiting room, the sterile white walls and the soft hum of fluorescent lights casting a clinical glow over everything. The room was filled with the occasional murmur of conversation from distant corners and the rhythmic beeping of medical equipment somewhere down the hall. The scent of antiseptic hung heavily in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of coffee from a nearby vending machine. Tsukauchi sat beside him, the two men occupying seats in the far corner of the room, as if they had chosen to isolate themselves from the rest of the waiting crowd. The detective's face was set in its usual serious expression, but there was an undercurrent of weariness in his eyes. He glanced at Izuku, noting the peculiar way he seemed to occupy the space, almost as if he were both there and not there at the same time. Izuku had settled next to Tsukauchi with an unspoken intent, his posture straight and rigid. He stared ahead, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance. The usual warmth and vibrancy that defined his demeanor were conspicuously absent. Instead, he exuded an unsettling calm, a stillness that seemed almost unnatural in the context of the hospital's anxious atmosphere. The silence between them grew heavy, stretching into what felt like an eternity. Tsukauchi shifted in his seat, his discomfort becoming increasingly apparent. He cleared his throat quietly, trying to find some semblance of normalcy in the oppressive quiet. He cast sidelong glances at Izuku, trying to gauge whether the younger man was aware of the awkwardness between them or if he was simply indifferent to it. Izuku broke the silence with a voice that was soft but carried an unnerving edge. You've been here a while, he said, his tone almost too smooth, like it had been practiced. Tsukauchi's eyebrows knit together in surprise, though he made an effort to keep his face neutral. Yes, he replied, his voice betraying a hint of the fatigue he felt. No point seeing him when he's unconscious. I need to talk to him as soon as he wakes. Izuku nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving their fixed point. Must be taxing, he said, his voice maintaining that same detached calm. Running on little sleep, dealing with constant stress. All to catch a vigilante. Tsukauchi nodded in agreement, though he was increasingly unsettled by Izuku's tone. It is, he said. But it's part of the job. Amora is still a law-breaker. So is the Amora case as a team effort. He asked, feigning curiosity. Kachan tried to get me involved. I think Dynamite has formed his own posse. Tsukauchi's response was measured. I'm not involved. Actually had case taken off my hands recently. But last night made it something new entirely. How so? The damn kid could have kicked the bucket. This may well have been attempted murder from Amora. That makes him a public threat rather than a social mischief. The air between them grew dense, as if the room had suddenly become too small. Despite the surrounding activity, their corner felt isolated, encased in an almost tangible silence. It was as though a barrier had formed, separating them from the surrounding world. Damn, Izuku said, his tone devoid of the usual warmth. He made an effort to sound interested, but there was an unsettling flatness to his words. I worry about Dynamite, the detective admitted. I think he knows more about Amora than he's letting on. Is that so? Izuku responded. His eyes remained focused ahead. Tsukauchi shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to catch Izuku's eye. What about you? He asked, curiosity barely veiling a hint of unease. How have things been for you? Since, he let the question trail off, unable to articulate what he truly wanted to ask. Izuku blinked slowly, as if the question had to travel a great distance to reach him. Boring, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. The word hung in the air, stark and detached. Tsukauchi's eyes widened slightly at the starkness of the response. But I have my hobbies. What kind of hobbies? You still writing those notes? The teacher sighed deeply in response, a sound that seemed to carry both resignation and contemplation. Slowly, as if drawn by an unseen force, Izuku rose from his seat. Just as he did, a female voice from the reception area called out with a commanding yet hesitant tone, "Midoriya." Izuku's face lit up with a subtle, knowing smile, as though he had anticipated the call. Heads in the room swiveled in unison toward him, a wave of surprise rippling through the crowd. The name, Midoriya, registered, yet many failed to connect the dots that this was the man they were speaking of. Tsukauchi's gaze sharpened, his eyes narrowing with a renewed focus on the enigmatic figure. From what he knew, Bakugo was still unconscious. Midoriya used to always be at the blonde's side. It was no surprise that he'd visit, but something about it held hints of animosity that he simply couldn't place. With his hands buried deep in his pockets, Izuku began to make his way down the row of chairs he had just vacated. At the entrance to the hospital rooms, a short woman stood by the double doors, her fingers fidgeting anxiously. She looked up as Izuku approached, her eyes wide with a mixture of nervousness and hope. Izuku offered her a warm, reassuring smile before halting his steps. He turned slowly, his gaze locking with Tsukauchi's for the first time, an unspoken challenge flickering in his eyes. The room seemed to hold its breath, a sudden hush descending as all attention turned toward Izuku. The ambient sounds of the hospital faded into a distant murmur, replaced by the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows outside. In that charged silence, a solitary echo cut through. Izuku's voice, low and dispassionate, uttered a brief but concealed statement. "I like to play tag." Before anyone could fully process his words, Izuku turned away and continued his stride as he exited the waiting room. "Sit down. Shut the hell up," Katsuki hissed. "Why are you here?" Izuku, mildly offended, crossed his arms. "Am I not allowed to be? You have work. You know my timetable." Katsuki paused. Izuku smirked with a hint of victory. He, in fact, did have work. He knew with certainty that he had work, because it wasn't even midday yet. Goosebumps laced his arms, making him glad that he was wearing the thick coat that somehow had found its way around his body. It was a foreign item of clothing, something that he'd never bought or owned in his life. A short, navy parka, with a fluffy hood and extremely soft pockets. It was not his coat. He didn't know whose coat it was, nor how it ended atop his skin. But it was definitely not his coat. That was only one of the things that he didn't understand. Above them all, there was still a very prominent issue swarming his mind. Izuku did not remember how he ended up at the hospital. He didn't know how he got out of teaching. He didn't know why he sat next to Detective freaking Tsukauchi. And he sure as hell didn't know why he said what he said to the man who literally could crumble his entire life with one single suspicion. It was almost as if somebody else was acting for him. He frowned knowingly at the thought. "Deku," Katsuki said again. Izuku steadied himself, realizing he'd zoned out. "Kachan, why are you here?" He wasn't shouting, almost as if he couldn't shout. "You already asked me that." "No." Katsuki took a step forward. "Seriously, why are you here?" A pregnant pause. "I'm worried," Izuku admitted. "I'm fine," he growled. Izuku shook his head. "The blow to the back of your head was serious, Kachan. You have a bad concussion. I can tell, not just because the doctor told me, but because you're acting differently." Katsuki threw his hands up in the air in exasperation. "And how many times have I been hit in the head, Deku?" "Too many," he sighed. "But that doesn't change anything." The blonde took a few hesitant steps back and sat down on the edge of the hospital bed. "Look, I don't know what you want from me, but I swear to hell and back if that damn Suka shitty sent you in here to talk me out of the case. If I still had my quirk, I'd be on his tail, you know." "What, Amora?" Katsuki tensed. "Gathered that. But why would you? You don't understand how much I want to tear him apart. I thought you said you didn't know shit. How much I want to make him hurt. Deku, make them pay. Deku, make them feel what I feel. Them. Truly studying the speaker, Katsuki found himself stumped. The once vibrant man, who had always exuded a robust energy and confidence, now appeared pallid, cold, and undeniably sickly. Katsuki had been so absorbed in his own world that he hadn't fully registered the change until that very moment. He looked at Deku, whose gaze was fixed on the ground, muttering a stream of disjointed and incoherent ramblings. Katsuki hadn't spent much time with Deku recently, this was true. In fact, their interactions over the past week had been the most they had spoken in several months. But even with that limited contact, Katsuki was keenly aware that nothing significant, nor notably traumatic, had transpired over the years to justify the stark transformation between the 18-year-old he had graduated with and the 21-year-old teacher now before him. The unsettling nature of this change gnawed at him, and although Katsuki was adept at maintaining his composure in most situations, this was goddamn Deku. This was different. Katsuki's symptoms of a severe concussion were becoming increasingly evident. Whatever lousy medications he'd been prescribed seemed to be losing their effectiveness. It was clear that he was likely not even supposed to be out of bed for this long, despite his current half-standing state. Still, he easily noticed when Deku's disjointed ramblings escalated from the singular pronoun, him, to a bewildering mix of they and them, leaving Katsuki uncertain whether Deku's disorganized thoughts were truly aimed at Amora or some other issue entirely. The growing agitation within Katsuki was difficult to mask, and despite his best efforts, a sliver of genuine concern began to surface. Unable to remain passive any longer, Katsuki pushed himself up from his seat, his own fatigue causing him to stumble slightly. His movements were abrupt and unsteady as he made his way toward Izuku. His initial intention was to give Deku a firm shake to snap him out of his daze, but his mounting frustration resulted in a more forceful action. With a sudden and violent push, Katsuki unintentionally slammed Deku against the wall. His hands gripped Deku's shoulders with a force that made it clear just how far his patience had worn thin. His face was a mask of intense fury, an expression that Deku was used to, and Katsuki was sure that the would fold beneath his gaze and come to his damn senses. Deku's body tensed under Katsuki's hold, but what was most striking was the lack of fear or submission in his eyes. Katsuki was acutely aware that Deku possessed the physical strength to break free from his grip if he so desired. But the Deku staring back at him was not the same as the timid, indecisive figure from their past. This was someone else entirely, someone imbued with a strength that was both unsettling and unfamiliar. Vague recollections hit him, memories of watching Deku fight back when they were 16, the bloodshed and pain. But Deku lost one for all years ago, so why was Katsuki still feeling this energy? Feeling such power? Unnerved by his overwhelmed senses, Katsuki released his grip, still standing uncomfortably close to Deku to assert some desperate level of dominance. "What have you done?" he asked, coldly, tentatively. Izuku placed a hand on the blonde's shoulder. Katsuki widened his eyes but didn't resist the touch. Carefully, Izuku tilted his head and wryly smiled. "Drop the case," he whispered. "No," Katsuki replied, mimicking the low tone. "I don't want to see you hurt. Deku, I swear to. Tell me. This is the most I can do for you, Kachan." His grip tightened. "Please. What the hell are you even going on about? God damn it, why are you so?" The hand slipped off his shoulder. Before Katsuki even realized, Izuku was heading for the door. "This concussion." "I'm so sorry," said a voice. It sounded like Deku, but Deku wasn't in the room anymore. Nobody was in the room. Was anybody even there in the first place? His head spun, fog clouding his vision. "Your fault, again. Where did Deku go?" "Your fault. Where the did Deku go?" It was getting dark. Was it nighttime? Had there been a power cut? Katsuki's mind ran before it couldn't any longer, and his body collapsed to the ground with a loud thud. "If you bitch in class again, I'll throw you off a roof," the voice warned. "Why did you let me see him? The only way to explain your wimpy breakdown was to say you were worried. All Might told you to go see him, so my refusal would have been suspicious. But I am worried. Be worried in private. Get out of my head." "Oh, Izuku," Amora sang. "Don't you understand?" "What?" he cried, violently shoving his hands in the parka pockets. He was glad that the UA hallways were empty, otherwise he would have gotten very strange looks. You're in my head. Chapter text. For the following days, Mr. Deku turned up to school in a suit and tie. His work attire, usually casual with basic sweaters or t-shirts, had turned evidently formal, as though he were expecting a royal guest of sorts. This did not go unnoticed by his students. The change of style reflected not only his outward appearance but also mirrored his altered personality. Mr. Deku had transformed into somebody more taut, more mentally concerned with things other than his lessons. He taught well, too well for a man who looked more tired than Aizawa himself, and that talent couldn't be changed. But Mr. Deku didn't look happy. Mr. Deku looked constantly concerned. And Yuji, being Class 1A's representative, felt he had a duty to uphold. Yuji didn't know why he was voted to be class representative. His grades weren't amazing, he talked too much, and he occasionally skipped classes out of pure laziness. But Yuji had a horrifically strong sense of care. When others told him to step down, he climbed the ladder even higher, ignoring the punishments that may face him once he got to the top. If he sensed even a mark of sadness in one of his classmates, he wouldn't let himself sleep peacefully until he knew they were content once more. Yuji was an empathy machine. This change in Mr. Deku became even more apparent during a 2-week timespan of tense conversations and paranoid eyes. Mr. Deku would often zone out or ramble to himself as though someone was next to him, physically initiating a conversation. These conversations were stressful, uncomfortable, and clearly agitated their teacher, but it was never clear who he was talking to and why. It was a daily topic brought up by the class, and it took 2 weeks for them to muster up the courage to finally say something about it. So, Yuji, fidgeting with his loose earphones, found himself at the faculty lounge door in UA after his final class of the day. A group of his classmates, including Nara, stood in a huddle behind him, silently encouraging him to knock. 3 harsh rasps sounded through the hall. For a moment, the silence grew deafening. But then the door opened, and a mildly confused All Might appeared where the door once was. The class unanimously shivered. Young Ishikawa, All Might, looked surprised. He knew of this boy from Midoriya's ramblings. "Can I help you?" "Why yes," he nodded. "Is Mr. Deku in here?" All Might shook his head. "You've just missed him by about 10 minutes. I can forward a message if you would like." "Number?" "No, that's fine." Really nervous, Yuji turned to face Nara. Yuji had blonde hair, much like his favorite hero Chargebolt, but lord how he wished he shared the man's charisma. Nara shot him a hopeful smile and the blonde bit his cheek before moving his glare back to All Might. "I was hoping to talk with you. In private." "Oh," All Might exclaimed. "Just you?" He nodded. Taking a step back, he held the door open for the student. "Come on in." Without a second thought, Yuji entered the room, hearing the door shut behind him. All Might motioned towards the sofa and pulled up a chair opposite, almost like a counselor's meeting. The room was engulfed with an expecting silence. "I have a faint idea as to why you're here," said All Might. Yuji bit his lip, but that wasn't enough. Without even realizing it, he blurted, "Is Mr. Deku okay?" "And why do you ask?" "It's just," Yuji began. "Ever since the Amora attack on the Dynamite Agency, he's been weird, you know. You were there when it all happened. I was the one who told him about the incident and he just froze up in class. Hell, you had to escort him out, because of what I said. I admire Mr. Deku, he's the world's greatest hero and all, but our class can't shake this feeling of dread every time we see him so tense and preoccupied. Like, when the hell did he start wearing suits? I just..." "Young man," All Might interrupted. "Breathe." Yuji's face flushed in embarrassment. "Sorry." The hero hummed. "I would be lying if I said I also wasn't concerned. I am. But please do not blame yourself for Midoriya's change. He has been through a lot over the years, and I can assure you that he is one of the most mentally secure people I know. Can you at least promise our class that you'll look into this? We all love Mr. Deku and can't bear." "I already am." Yuji nodded, standing up from the sofa on shaky legs. At that same moment, the faculty lounge door opened, and Eraser had entered the room with a stern look on his face. Enjoy your evening, young Ishikawa, All Might waved. Thank you, sir. Yuji bowed before hurriedly rushing out of the room. The second the door closed again, Aizawa took the seat where Yuji previously sat. All Might didn't even move, simply crossing his arms in understanding. Next patient, he joked. Aizawa deadpanned. He avoided the route again. Suddenly, all of All Might's amusement dissipated. You're joking. His apartment, or at least the address stated on his health form, is Central Musudafu. UA has a direct road that takes you to the central streets. There are no nearby stores for him to detour towards, nor does anyone close to him live in the area. It makes no sense. I've been thinking, Aizawa said, about his early days as staff. The first few months, we gave him rides to his apartment, and he accepted happily. But suddenly he began denying them. Even if we clocked out at similar times, he would still say no to a lift. Why? Where is he going? Hell, if I know, grunted Aizawa. But evidence proves that he usually doesn't make it back to his apartment until the late hours of the night. Have you been watching him? Aizawa pulled out his phone. Security cameras. How did you get that? How do you think? Naomasa. Aizawa nodded. I didn't suggest anything. Luckily, his apartment was broken into a few weeks back, so I just made it out like I was investigating that again for some reason. Tsukauchi knows not to ask me too many questions. All Might took the phone from Aizawa and looked over the clips. Within them, a messily dressed figure was visible, looking rather tired and unkempt. Each clip was edited to show him walking down the corridor, unlocking his apartment door, and stumbling in. And each clip had the time written in the corner, every one being later than 2 a.m. He isn't drunk, All Might concluded. Evidently, agreed Aizawa. However, he looks very disorganized. Especially in the recent weeks, when this suit crap began, his outfits look thrown on and vastly different to how they were when he left work that day. Almost as if he'd changed in a hurry or without care. Young Midoriya has never been one to tell us when he's struggling. Even his students see his distress. Problem's child becomes the problem adult. Aizawa ran a hand across his face. And yet again, I fear that Bakugo is a trigger. I agree. Young Ishikawa also believes that the biggest change followed the dynamite attack. Midoriya visited him in hospital the day of. He did. Naomasa told me. Apparently, Midoriya entered moments after Bakugo woke up for the first time and immediately tried to leave the room before collapsing. Midoriya stated that Bakugo was unconscious again when he arrived, but Naomasa struggled to believe it. Knowing them, Midoriya said something that got Bakugo to stand up. Young Bakugo hasn't said anything otherwise, though. Aizawa looked down. Surely if something interesting were said, Bakugo would have mentioned it to someone. He was deadly silent in the hospital, only asked to talk to some woman called Susan who just made him angrier. Same old. All Might tapped his fingers against his crossed arms. We should talk to him. Bakugo. Yes. Is he discharged? Recently, I believe. That head injury was severe. He can handle it, Shota. You know that more than anybody. Aizawa bitterly nodded. I'll give him a call. Thanks to his face planting onto the hospital floor, Katsuki had to endure a longer stay than he'd originally anticipated, much to his frustration. Hospitals weren't for him. The constant beeping machines, the sterile scent of antiseptic, and the way the nurses treated him like some fragile piece of glass drove him up the wall. He hated it. To make things worse, Susan, supporting her haughty typicality, had completely ignored his repeated pleas for an escape plan. Damn Susan. It was almost 2 weeks before he was finally discharged, and by then, Katsuki was itching to move, to do anything other than stare at the same 4 walls of that sterile room. The nurses had banned his visitors after that incident with Deku, probably assuming he'd thrown himself out of bed the moment his old rival showed up. Now, alone in his own space, those memories of the hospital stuck in Katsuki's mind, particularly the horrific encounter with Deku. Everything about that visit was off, unsettling, and the knowingness that Katsuki had nobody to talk to about it was eating him alive. Sure, he could have called up Shitty Hair and told him what had happened, but something about the interaction felt personal, almost intimate. Katsuki felt, for some reason, that telling others about what happened so soon was a betrayal. He didn't know why. When Deku had walked into the room, Katsuki had felt an immediate sense of unease. His arrival was surprising. Even though Izuku had always made it a point to check in, whether Katsuki wanted it or not, they really hadn't interacted enough in recent months for such a philanthropic act. And this time, Deku didn't seem like himself. His usual overenthusiastic, wide-eyed worry was muted. His voice, though laced with uncertainty, was too measured, too calm. The typical flurry of energy that seemed to surround Deku wherever he went was strangely absent. He didn't fidget. He didn't stammer. Instead, he stood with a strong composure, layers of secrecy blocking his true thoughts from surfacing. "What have you done?" he asked, coldly, tentatively. Izuku placed a hand on the blonde's shoulder. Katsuki widened his eyes but didn't resist the touch. Carefully, Izuku tilted his head and wryly smiled. "Drop the case," he whispered. "No," Katsuki replied, mimicking the low tone. "I don't want to see you hurt. Deku, I swear to. Tell me. This is the most I can do for you, Kachan." His grip tightened. "Please." The whole interaction had put Katsuki on edge, and not in the usual way Deku got under his skin. It was so odd, so out of character and distant that the memory made him feel physically ill. What really bothered Katsuki was how hazy the memory felt. He remembered Deku talking to him, asking him to drop the case, but there were gaps, fragments of the conversation that slipped away the more he tried to recall them. It was like trying to hold on to smoke. Katsuki couldn't even remember what Deku had said before he left. That part was a blur, as if it had been wiped from his mind entirely. All he knew was that by the time Deku had walked out of the room, Katsuki felt an unsettling sense of confusion, like he had missed something important. That was when the nurses rushed in, fussing and yelling at him for being out of bed. He was on the floor, half awake. They thought Deku's visit had triggered it, assuming Katsuki had tried to leap out of bed the moment he saw his old rival. But that wasn't true. He'd already been up, confused, before Deku even arrived. The weird part was that he wasn't sure why. Even now, back home and away from the hospital, his thoughts circled back to that strange visit. The entire event was gnawing at him. Deku, Amora, his damn agency. Damn Susan. But the first two, Deku and Amora, were in italics within his thoughts. No matter where he looked, his focus always returned to those two names. Deku, Amora. Just as he was mulling over it, his phone buzzed. A familiar number flashed on the screen. He hesitated for a moment, thumb hovering over the answer button. Was it Deku? He blinked at the screen, eyes adjusting to the light. "Aizawa, Problem Child 2, the familiar voice said from over the phone. "We need to have a chat." Chapter text. "Come on, man." Before the mugger could even turn toward the voice, the vigilante was on him. A blur of motion, then a dull thud as a heavy boot collided with his ribs. The man's body hit the ground hard, skidding against the damp concrete. A sickening crack echoed off the alley walls as the mugger landed awkwardly on his arm. He screamed in agony, rolling over, clutching his shattered limb. The woman whom he was attempting to rob pushed herself against the wall in fear. Hands shaking, she clutched her red handbag against her chest, cradling it like a baby. "You can't rob a lady this close to Halloween," chimed Amora, placing a heavy foot atop the mugger's body. "She's got candy to buy." "Scum." The mugger wheezed, trying to control his breathing as he wriggled under the boot. Feigning hurt, Amora placed a hand dramatically over his heart. "Me, scum, have you seen yourself?" The mugger's eyes darted around in panic, desperation clawing at his voice. "Heroes, help me," he screamed, his voice echoing in the narrow alley. Amora's eyes narrowed in anger. He knew the mugger's game: call for help and play the victim. The heroes would rush in, thinking Amora was the threat. After all, he was no hero in their eyes. He might stop crime, but he wasn't one of their shining idols, especially after he had a little too much fun at the Dynamite Agency. The woman, paralyzed by fear, finally snapped out of it and bolted down the alley toward the main street, her heels clicking frantically against the pavement. Amora shook his head. He never understood why people wandered through dark alleys in Musudafu, especially alone. It was practically an invitation to be mugged. Heroes, shut the hell up, Amora snarled, his patience wearing thin. He shifted his weight and pulled out a small knife, kneeling on the mugger's chest. The blade gleamed as he pressed it lightly against the man's throat, not deep enough to cut, but close enough to scare. The mugger froze, fear replacing the defiance in his eyes. Amora had no intention of killing him, but the thought lingered at the edge of his mind. It would be so easy. One quick motion and Izuku Amora caught himself, shaking his head. He wasn't here to kill. Not like this. He leaned down closer, his voice a low growl. You make another sound, and you die. The man whimpered, nodding frantically. That was all Amora needed. He shoved the mugger's head into the pavement, knocking him out cold with a swift punch to the temple. He wiped the blood from his knuckles onto his jacket, satisfied with the unconscious heap of a man beneath him. The alley was silent now, save for the faint hum of traffic on the nearby street. He breathed in the cold night air, feeling the tension in his muscles slowly begin to unwind. But that calm didn't last long. A subtle shift in the atmosphere sent a chill down his spine, familiar, heavy, like the weight of impending conflict. Amora tensed, his body instinctively readying itself. He didn't even need to turn around to know who was there. He could sense him. Stop right there. The voice was rough, but not in the way of criminals. It carried the authority of a hero, someone who stood on the moral high ground, unwavering. Amora's heart sank a little deeper into the pit of his stomach. Red Riot, Amora muttered under his breath. He raised his hands in what seemed like surrender, keeping his back to the voice. Of course. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoed in the narrow alleyway. Eijiro Kirishima, Red Riot, appeared, stepping into the dim glow of the flickering streetlight. His spiky red hair was unmistakable, as was the determined scowl on his face. His broad frame, adorned in the black and red hero costume, looked larger than life in the shadows, and the way his fists clenched at his sides left no room for negotiation. Amora, Red Riot's voice was tense. The vigilante who put Dynamite in hospital. Not very manly of you, bro. Want an autograph? Amora let out a bitter chuckle. Sending Kirishima, really? Amora hadn't allowed Izuku to see Bakugo since the hospital, so there was no true way of knowing if the man was out of the hospital yet. He had purposely hit the hero hard enough to get him out of the game for a little while, but he truly should have expected one of their classmates to search for him in the meantime. There was a cruel irony to it, one that twisted his gut in ways he hated. No, not in the slightest. How's Blondie doing? Amora asked, finally turning to face him and lowering his arms. Maybe Amora was teasing, or maybe Izuku was curious. Neither of them really knew. His voice was cold, detached, and taming the storm of emotions threatening to surface. He couldn't let Kirishima see it, couldn't let him recognize what lay beneath the mask of the vigilante. I didn't come for a chat, Red Riot shot back, his eyes narrowing as he glanced down at the unconscious mugger on the ground. You're roughing people up in back alleys, Amora. This isn't hero work. Amora gritted his teeth, the knife still gripped tightly in his hand. Good thing I'm not a hero, he said, tone sharp. Maybe not, Kirishima admitted, taking another step forward. But what you're doing is still crossing the line. You're taking justice into your own hands. You can't just beat the hell out of people. Amora's blood boiled at his words. As if Kirishima understood, as if any of them did. That guy, Amora gestured toward the unconscious mugger. He was robbing a woman at knife point. And what? You want me to wait around for someone like you to show up and save the day? The system's broken, Red Riot. Heroes like you just keep pretending it's not. Ungrateful, blind, privileged heroes. Kirishima's eyes darkened, the lines of his jaw tightening. There's a difference between stopping a crime and becoming one yourself. Have you considered going to the HPSC? They can help you. Amora barked a short, humorless laugh. And what would you know? Hell, you heroes have had everything handed to you since the war. What about the people who lost? Maybe he shouldn't have said that. What about the people you forgot? Maybe he shouldn't have said that either. Why am I talking like this? I usually have everything under control. Is this Izuku? Kirishima hesitated for a moment, squinting, the tension in the air thickening. Amora, Who are you? He asked, lowering his voice. Am I supposed to know you? That cut deeper than Kirishima could ever know. Amora clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out, not at Red Riot, but at the weight of the past, at the truth he could never speak. Kirishima didn't know him, not anymore, but Amora knew him, remembered him as the kid who had always been so earnest, so full of heart, so determined to become a hero. Amora couldn't let Kirishima connect the dots. He couldn't let Kirishima see who he really was. Izuku wouldn't allow that. I don't have time for this, Amora snapped, his voice more venomous than he intended. Walk away, Red Riot. But Kirishima wasn't the type to back down. His eyes burned with determination, the same fire that had made him a hero in the first place. I can't do that, he said firmly, his fists beginning to harden, his quirk activating. The stone-like texture of his skin gleamed in the faint light. You know I can't. Amora's grip tightened on the knife at his side, but he didn't draw it. He wasn't going to kill Kirishima. He couldn't, but the thought of fighting him, that was another matter entirely. And there was a part of him that wanted this, a part that needed to release the anger, the frustration, the bitterness that had been festering for too long. Red Riot lunged forward, his stone fists coming down like sledgehammers. Amora barely dodged, his body twisting to the side as Kirishima's fist smashed into the pavement, sending chunks of concrete flying. You're making a mistake, Amora hissed, sidestepping another powerful blow. His heart raced, every movement calculated, every dodge fueled by the instinct to survive rather than hurt. But Kirishima was fast, faster than he remembered. Then stop me, Red Riot shouted, his voice filled with raw determination as he swung again. This time, Amora managed to act, catching Kirishima's arm with his own. The impact sent a jolt of pain through his bones, but he held firm, shoving Kirishima back. I'm not going to kill you, Amora growled, his voice low and strained. But I won't hold back. Kirishima hesitated, his brow furrowing as he stared at Amora, confusion flickering behind his eyes. Why not? He asked, his voice quieter now, almost searching. You've fought worse. Why didn't you kill Dynamite when you could? Where the hell did that come from? Amora's heart skipped a beat, the truth hanging heavy in the air between them. He couldn't tell Kirishima that they'd once been friends, that there was a time when they fought side by side, that Izuku still cared. Izuku was watching, stopping him from saying anything else that would impact them both. Instead, Amora's expression darkened, the anger flaring up again. This isn't your fight, Red Riot, he snapped, pushing Kirishima back with a powerful shove. This isn't your fight either, man. Kirishima, though momentarily staggered, quickly recovered and charged again, harder and faster. But this time, Amora was too slow. One of Kirishima's fists grazed his side, and the pain was immediate, a sharp, burning sensation that spread like fire through his ribs. Amora gritted his teeth, stumbling backward. Blood seeped through his jacket, staining the fabric. It wasn't deep, but it was enough to weaken him. Kirishima's eyes widened as he realized he'd landed a hit. Amora, stand down. You're hurt. But Amora's pride wouldn't allow it. He forced himself to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his side. You're too soft, he muttered, staggering back as he reached for the nearest fire escape ladder. That's why I'll always win. Before Kirishima could react, Amora pulled himself up onto the metal ladder, scaling it quickly despite the injury. The pain was unbearable, but adrenaline fueled him, driving him forward. He needed to get out of sight, needed to escape before Kirishima got any closer. Amora, Kirishima shouted from below, his voice full of frustration and concern. But Amora didn't stop. He disappeared onto the rooftop, the shadows swallowing him whole as he vanished into the night. Shitty hair. A voice sounded through the phone. Kirishima hummed, mind distant. Shitty hair, is he gone? Katsuki yelled. He's gone. Chase him. No, Mina, seemingly on the move, heaved. Is Denki still on the call? Is he on his way? I'm on my way, Kaminari confirmed. If someone doesn't chase him I'll go out there myself. Screamed Katsuki. No, if you dare. Kirishima stared empty-eyed at the rooftop, suddenly feeling as though it was a mile away. Something hit him, some ambiguous epiphany, and he suddenly realized why Bakugo was so damn obsessed with this vigilante. Katsuki's voice calmed slightly, if possible. Kirishima, man, can you go after Amora? I can't bring myself to move, man, the hero admitted. Why? Said Mina, concerned. Are you hurt? No, I'm just, he trailed. I feel like I know him. Katsuki hurled his phone onto the bed, immediately standing up and pacing the room. The impact barely satisfied the frustration gnawing at his chest. I'm gonna blow myself up, Bakugo thought to himself, fists tightening. Because the truth was, he'd been thinking the same thing all along. He'd tried to place it, but couldn't. Nothing made sense. Every idea was a dead end, or simply impossible. But he heard that call. He'd interacted with Amora in the agency and he'd spoken to Amora on that rooftop. And every single time, he found himself coming to the same conclusion. Amora was way too familiar to be a stranger. He raised the phone to his ear, voice stern. Boys, he said. Mina growled, humming along with the varied words of affirmation. It's time to lock in. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.